Chapter 519. Chi, rushing through the wall of fire. He landed on the ground, rolled a few times, and stood up. Tang touched his hair, which had just made a slight noise, and could clearly smell the smell of something burning. Of course, this was due to Tang's speed. If it had been someone else, they would have ended up like the wilderness wolf riders. However, charging through the wall of fire did not mean that the danger was over. Previously, in order to chase after Fry and the others, many wilderness wolf riders had gathered here. Therefore, when Twain raised his head, he saw that a few steps away, about 100 barbarians were staring blankly at him from the wall of fire. Their gazes were complicated. Despair, hatred, emptiness. In summary, despair was the majority. More than 100 muscular barbarians were standing in front of him, but they didn't have the slightest bit of vitality. It was a lifeless atmosphere. Rubbing his nose, Tang suddenly felt a lot of pressure. With more than 100 wilderness wolf riders charging at him, even he could only temporarily avoid them. He waved his hand. Haha, everyone is here. Cough, cough, there's a fire. It's going to burn people to death. Everyone should run. There was some fluctuation in the deathly still eyes. A wilderness wolf rider looked at Tang and slowly raised his spear. His face instantly distorted. Kill him. Kill. As if a barrel of gunpowder had been ignited, more than 100 wilderness wolf riders instantly went berserk. Their blood-red eyes were suddenly filled with killing intent as they raised their spears and rushed over like a tide. Fuck! Without hesitation, Tang sprinted to the left, crouching close to the ground and leaping out in an instant, avoiding the spear attack from the outside. Then he forcefully lifted his back in the air, stood up, and stepped on an ancient tree that was burning and collapsing. He rose into the air and quickly disappeared into the thick smoke. Of course, this was only temporary, but avoiding their line of sight meant that he had more space to escape. After all, he came to find someone, not to sprinkle salt on the wounds of these dying people. After landing, Tang didn't hesitate and quickly changed directions. Turning his head, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Although there were wilderness wolf riders chasing after him, there weren't many of them. There were only a dozen of them. What about the rest? Could it be that they have dispersed the encirclement? Tang had just thought of this when he suddenly heard a roar mixed with the sound of constant coughing. Then, these sounds were drowned out by deafening screams. Now that the smoke had spread, as long as they opened their mouths, the smoke would enter their throats. Naturally, coughing was unavoidable. As for the screams, Tang narrowed his eyes slightly and revealed a slightly strange expression. It was clear that the scene of him passing through the wall of fire unscathed had given these wilderness wolf riders great courage. If he guessed correctly, those people were now following in his footsteps. Of course, the outcome would definitely be different. May God bless you. Tang observed a moment of silence in his heart as he looked at the dozen barbarians who were chasing after him. They immediately abandoned him and returned to their original spot. Skipping this interlude, Tang circled around the previous vacuum passage and patiently searched the periphery of the radiation. Michaud was the one who chose this empty passage, so it was impossible for him to not know its location. Therefore, the biggest possibility was that they had been entangled by the wilderness wolf riders on the way here. Of course, death was also a possibility. After all, the strength of the wilderness wolf riders was not low. If they had accidentally bumped into more than 100 barbarians, the result would have been obvious. However, the only one who would have died would be David. It would be difficult for Michaud to be surrounded. With his speed, it was almost impossible to stop him in such an environment. Therefore, there must be other variables in this. The momentum of the fire was getting stronger and stronger. The north of the jungle had completely turned into a sea of fire with the help of the cold wind. Now, the fastest way to kill people was not the fire, but the constantly falling, hugging trees and the billowing smoke. Especially the latter. The smoke hid fine particles that could not be seen by the naked eye. If one inhaled too much of it, they would choke and faint, and then be covered by the fire. This was also the reason why he could not shout loudly. Of course, those stupid wilderness wolf riders just now did not count. They roared because they had the courage to run into the wall of fire. Tang and had completely held his breath when he came in. As long as he did not speak, it would not be a big problem. As an assassin, this was just a trivial skill that was sometimes used when hiding in the water to assassinate. But even so, his blood-red eyes were already filled with tears, and his vision was gradually blurred. His whole body was tense, as if most of the water inside had been swallowed by the scorching air. Everything was clearly reminding him that he could not stay in this place any longer. Looking at the sea of fire that was getting closer and closer to the north, Tang pursed his lips, and his eyes became sharp again. At this time, his footsteps suddenly stopped, and he turned his head, frowning. There were all kinds of sound around. The sound of falling trees, the crackling of burning plants, and the dying screams. But Tang still caught the sound of weapons clashing. Turning to the left, Tang Un's mood was not very happy. The sound of weapons clashing was not fake, but it was hard to say whether it was David or not. Because in addition to the wilderness wolf riders, there were still some soldiers left in their team. Tang Un had even seen a few of them. Some had fainted and fallen to the ground, while others were being slaughtered. Tang Un only looked and did not lend a helping hand. He was not a saint, at least not now. Compared to David and Michaud, he did not care about the lives of these soldiers. Before, he had seriously searched for them, but now? Sorry, he sighed. Bypassing a few fallen trees, Tang Un rushed to the place where the weapons clashed. Looking at the slightly chaotic battlefield, the corners of his mouth could not help but rise. But in an instant, his eyes became cold. In the middle of the battlefield was David and Michaud, who were now surrounded by about 40 to 50 wilderness wolf riders. But only David resisted. Michaud was lying motionless on David's back. The short spear in his back seemed to have been pierced, and blood kept flowing out. It was a shocking sight. Needless to say, this was the so-called variable. Although Tang Un did not understand why Michaud was the one who fell, the fact was that as soon as Michaud fell, David, who was not good at speed, was naturally entangled by the wilderness wolf riders. Fuck! Tang Un saw that Michaud's life was uncertain, and his face was ashen. He immediately suppressed the killing intent in his heart and quickly observed the surrounding environment. His heart was slightly determined, and he rushed out with thunder. The besieging wilderness wolf riders did not expect Tang Un to jump out from behind, and because of the height of their companions and the smoke in the sky, the wilderness wolf riders on the opposite side did not notice that Tang Un had come close to them. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The sound of the daggers whistling was completely covered by the surrounding sound. But the following effect could not be concealed. The wilderness wolf riders who were madly attacking from the front stopped their spears and stared blankly at the 3 or 4 barbarians on the opposite side. Their necks seemed to have turned into a fountain, and in an instant, blood spurted out and splashed in all directions. The barbarians in front of Tang Un could see this scene, but not the barbarians in front of him. Their eyes were bloodshot, and they madly attacked the last enemy in front of them. They were the famous wilderness wolf riders in the northern wilderness. Even if they were to be burned to death in humiliation, they would still kill all the enemies in front of them before they died. But it was a pity that these barbarians were destined to not be able to fulfill their dying wish. Just as they were about to attack, they suddenly felt a sharp pain in their necks, and then their vision swayed rapidly. They saw the sea of fire in the distance, and also the familiar headless bodies below. They also saw a black-armored figure spinning the blade in his hand, and quickly harvesting the heads of his companions in front of him. Break! After cutting off the head of the barbarian innermost, Tang Un's eyes sharpened. He punched to the left and right, and the headless bodies immediately fell to the side, pressing down on the barbarians behind them. Boss! Cough, cough! David, who was covered in blood, immediately cried out in surprise when he saw Tang Un coming to kill him. But soon after, he coughed violently because of the smoke in his throat. David also knew how to hold his breath. It was because of this that he was able to hold on for so long under the siege of the barbarians who were seriously affected by his constant coughing. Let's go. Tang Un's right foot nimbly jumped, and he grabbed a barbarian's spear. He shouted concisely, David heard this and immediately swept his sword, forcing the barbarians behind him to retreat. Then, he quickly rushed past Tang Yin. The wilderness wolf riders naturally wouldn't give up after seeing this. They were going to die without a doubt. Killing the two barbarians in front of them was their last thought. However, before they could crazily press forward, Tang Yin's spear had already drawn a half arc on the ground, and a string of fallen leaves flew up. Along the way, it brushed past the burning branches and immediately formed a long fire snake, dancing in front of the barbarians. Whoosh! Fire was created by man, but man had an almost natural fear of fire. The barbarians subconsciously took a step back as the sparks shone in front of them. When they opened their eyes again, they found that the two damned brand had already run more than 10 steps away. Chase! Kill them! Cough! Cough! Amidst the roars, dozens of wilderness wolf riders gnashed their teeth and chased after them. From this point, it was obvious that they had completely lost their rationality. At such a distance, a short spear was undoubtedly more effective than a long spear, but they couldn't think of a way. Go to hell and kill your mother. Cough, cough. The last few coughs had undoubtedly reduced the deterrence of these murderous words, but Tang Yin was more concerned about the actual effect. Misho's current situation was unknown, and he would definitely not let these barbarians go, even if he was going to die later. His figure flashed like a ghost, and his long spear was like a whip once again, but this time the target wasn't the barbarians behind him. Instead, it was the continuously burning ancient trees beside him. Bang, bang, bang. The northern wilderness wolf riders who had chased after Misho raised their heads, and their line of sight was filled with dozens of burning ancient trees, and a wave of heat hit their faces. Boom, boom, boom. Chapter 520. When the smoking Tang Yin and David rushed out of the fire, Fry and the rest who were guarding outside heaved a sigh of relief. They could not care less about sealing the exit and hurriedly retreated. They retreated until they reached a small mound a few hundred meters away before they were out of the smoke. Then, the 200 or so people stopped and silently turned around to look at the scene behind them. The dense forest had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a sea of raging flames and thick black smoke that covered the sky and covered the sun. There were no screams or howls of death. Perhaps it was because the sound of the fire had drowned them out. Occasionally, a few fiery figures of various sizes could be seen rushing out. The big ones rolled on the ground and soon stopped moving. They were probably the wilderness wolf riders. The small ones were running around randomly with sparks. They were small animals. The fire borrowed the wind, and the smoke borrowed the wind. It was probably an illusion, but in the eyes of the soldiers, the black smoke that was rising from the ground looked like the head of a ferocious demon under the blowing of the cold wind. Now, the demon was opening its huge mouth and spitting out the dense forest below. The monstrous fire was wanton and enchanting, and the wind howled like ghosts and howled like wolves. It was like Azura's purgatory, and it made people shudder. The soldiers had mixed feelings. Of course, most of them were glad that they had escaped death, but there was also regret that their companions hadn't been as lucky. There was also a faint sense of pride that they had been able to kill the same number of wilderness wolf riders. Misho wasn't dead, but his injuries were very serious. The short spear had completely pierced through his lower abdomen, and he had lost too much blood. He was already unconscious. This kind of injury was very troublesome. If they didn't remove the short spear, he would lose all his blood. But if they did, it would be too risky. Laying Misho down on the ground, Tang Yin's expression was solemn. After observing for a while, he quickly took out the short spear. Blood immediately spurted out. Misho's closed eyes suddenly widened. He subconsciously tried to raise his body, but Tang Yin forced him down, and he fell unconscious again. Ignoring the blood on his forehead, Tang Yin took the white porcelain bottle that Luke handed to him. He turned the bottle and sprinkled the yellowish powder evenly. Then, he took a few more bottles and sprinkled the powder one by one. Soon, the spurting blood was under control. Then, she gently flipped Misho's body over and applied the powder on his body. Finally, she opened Misho's mouth and stuffed a black pill into it. These medicines were the best that could be found on the market. As long as they were applied in time, there shouldn't be much of a problem in the short term. Of course, the price of these medicines was naturally not cheap, but Tang In was rich and overbearing, and the gray space was extremely precious to him, so he specially purchased them before he set off. However, when the soldiers were injured, Tang In and the others did not take them out. You could say that he was selfish or stingy. These life-saving items could only be used on themselves. At most, they would bring Fry and his old brothers with them. It was impossible to give them to others. This series of actions didn't take long, only about 10 seconds. However, Tang In's forehead was already covered in sweat. It wasn't easy at all. After he was done, he checked Michaud's breathing and heaved a sigh of relief. Wiping the blood and sweat off his face, Tang In got up and looked at Luke and the others, who had gathered with worried expressions. He waved his hand and said, "Let's go. We're fine for now. Well, go and get a stretcher. Michaud is in no condition to move around. Right, in the next few days, when you investigate, pay attention to stopping the bleeding and collecting anti-infection herbs." Phew! Hearing that, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Without another word, he immediately turned around and led the others into the woods on the other side of the hill. After everyone dispersed, Tang In looked at the pale Michaud and pursed his lips. His expression was still gloomy. He was fine for now. The short spear hadn't hurt Michaud's vitals. Although it was troublesome, it wasn't fatal. The biggest reason why he was unconscious was that he had lost too much blood. However, it was a little hard to say what would happen next. After such a serious injury, it was easy to get infected and cause complications such as fever. Tang In and the others had a lot of good medicine on them, but none of them could treat headaches and fevers. This was also a situation that no one had expected. Previously, when they knew that they were going to the battlefield, they had prepared some medicine to treat internal and external injuries. Shaking his head, Tang In's expression became determined again. No matter what, if they couldn't find these herbs, they had to steal them even if they had to sneak into the barbarian army. After making up his mind, Tang In raised his eyebrows and saw David standing to the side in a daze. At this time, he was staring blankly at the unconscious Michaud. His eyes were dull, and the usually cheerful David looked very gloomy. Tang In's heart skipped a beat. He walked over and patted David's shoulder. "Don't think too much. Michaud will be fine." "Boss." Turning his head, David seemed to have recognized Tang In after a while. He opened his mouth, and his voice was very hoarse and dry. I. He wanted to say something, but stopped, and his face was full of self-blame. Tang In already knew the reason for Michaud's injury. After David finished setting the fire, he came in to help. Unfortunately, he bumped into dozens of barbarian wolf riders. Whether he could defeat them or not was secondary. The key was that he would be in trouble if he got entangled, so David didn't hesitate to turn around and run away. After all, he had followed Tang In for so long. Even if he couldn't become an assassin, his hiding skills were not bad. However, just as David was about to shake off his pursuers, he bumped into dozens of barbarian wolf riders again. When the fire first started, most of the wilderness wolf riders were scattered, but David had encountered two groups in a row. This was a matter of luck. Being surrounded, David had no choice but to fight back with his sword and retreat. At that time, the barbarians had not lost their minds, so barbarians used their short spears. David's fighting style was more of frontal attack. Dealing with complicated situations was his weakness. He was flustered and in a precarious situation. Finally, when he was trying his best to resist, a short spear pierced through his defense and silently stabbed towards David's back. Needless to say, the short spear was blocked by Michaud's body. Although he was seriously injured at that time, Michaud did not lose his ability to fight. It was not until later that he could not hold on and fainted that David carried him on his back. Finally, when Twain arrived, "It's my fault. If I didn't block the spear, he wouldn't be like this. I, 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 I. I'm such a bastard. It was clear that David was now in a state of self-blame and shame. Needless to say, he blamed himself for implicating Michaud. As for shame, it was a bit more complicated. In fact, when the team had just set off from Dawn City, Tang In had noticed that there were still some problems between David and Michaud. It wasn't that they were divided, but there was indeed some awkwardness and estrangement. This naturally couldn't be seen on the surface. The two of them cooperated as usual. However, the attitude of the two of them who used to tease Fearless was completely gone. It was completely businesslike. If Michaud's group was scouting ahead, David's subordinates would definitely not be able to get close to them. Of course, as long as Tang In was there, the two of them naturally wouldn't quarrel. It was a bit like a Cold War between a young couple. After Tang In noticed the situation, he tried to ease it, but the effect was not good. Michaud was very easy to talk to. As long as Tang In gave him a hint, he would be able to talk to David freely. However, David's character was stubborn. He probably thought that Michaud was pretending and was not sincere. With such thoughts in mind, he naturally wouldn't show his sincerity. But now is a good opportunity. Thinking of this, Tang In chuckled and said, "Haha, if you hadn't blocked that attack, the one standing here would be Michaud." "Well, I just want to ask, if Michaud was in danger just now, would you save him?" Looking at David, who nodded without hesitation, Tang In smiled and said, "Yes, of course I would save him, right? We are all brothers who have gone through fire and water together, so there's no need to say such pretentious words. And, what's wrong with saying bad things behind my back? Which one of you hasn't been scolded by me during training? Do you all have a problem with me and want to stab me in the back?" Of course not. Boss, it's not like that. This is..." After struggling for a while, David kept scratching his head, but still couldn't find the right words to describe it. Stealing the concept. Haha, it's easy to fool simple-minded people. Tang In waved his hand seriously and said, "It doesn't matter what this is. Well, the most important thing is to save Michaud's life. David, the next journey will be more difficult. We can't kill barbarians to get food, and Michaud has lost too much blood, so he needs to eat well. So, I'll leave this to you. No matter what method you use, you have to hunt fresh food every day. Is there a problem?" "No problem." David patted his chest and said solemnly, "Even if I have to dig 3 feet into the ground, I will find it." "Good." Tang In clapped his hands and smiled, patting David's shoulder. I don't believe that you won't make up with me." Chapter 5:21. The forest in front of them was not big, but it was not small either. As long as the weather didn't suddenly change and there wasn't a snowstorm, the fire here would burn for a long time. Fortunately, the surrounding area was full of hills, so it was unlikely to cause a large-scale fire. Even if the forest was burned to ashes, it would eventually be extinguished. Now that the forest was covered in fire and smoke, it could be seen from more than 10 miles away. Obviously, it was not a good idea to stay here for long. Therefore, even though everyone had narrowly escaped death in the fire and was extremely exhausted, Fry still managed to reorganize the team and set off. The total number of people was more than 250. This result was undoubtedly depressing. One had to know that there were still more than 600 people in this group this morning. Who would have thought that after this encounter, more than half of them would be dead or injured? Moreover, their destination was still far away without a trace. This couldn't help but cast a shadow over their hearts. Of course, this gloomy was very faint. After all, the opponent they just encountered was the famous wilderness wolf cavalry. They were able to survive almost the same number of people, and they also caused a big fire to burn most of the wilderness wolf cavalry to death. This kind of achievement, if spread out, would be enough to shock the 3 frontline armies and the northern wilderness tribes. Just like when they saw the fire, one of the soldiers couldn't help but sigh. Even if they died now, it would be worth it. In front of the team, "Pang, how is Michaud?" Looking at the simple stretcher made of branches and green vines, Fry broke the slightly depressing atmosphere of the team and turned around to ask. Tang and shook his head slightly. "The wound is under control. There shouldn't be any big problems for the time being." "That's good." Fry patted Tang's shoulder and comforted him. "Don't worry, with Michaud's physique and strength, he'll be fine." That's right, Brother Twain. Your gray space? Well, the people inside are all extraordinary people, and they won't be sacrificed so easily. Yes, I have experience in this. As long as we can get through the first few days, the rest will be much better. Eltek and Taka also gave their blessings, but their smiles were a bit forced. They didn't seem to be in high spirits. This was to be expected. The Heavy Sword Battalion and the Tomahawk Battalion were relatively weaker. After the intense battle, these two battalions of the brand had been completely destroyed. Eltek and Taka only had a few dozen soldiers left under their command, and they were on the verge of becoming single battalion commanders. With this topic of conversation, the atmosphere in the team finally eased a little. In this day and age, being a frontline soldier meant that there was no tomorrow. They had seen too many of their comrades who were alive and kicking beside them turn into cold corpses in the blink of an eye. Over time, they had naturally become numb and tolerant. Gradually, Fry and the others changed the topic from the casualties to the escape route. Those wilderness wolf riders shouldn't be completely wiped out. After suffering such a huge loss, they definitely won't let us go. If it's a surprise attack, their remaining forces won't be enough, but we still have to be careful of being tracked. What Fry said was the truth. Previously, when Twain gave the order to set fire, the Wilderness Wolf Cavalry had immediately retreated. Although most of the Wilderness Wolf Riders were disregarded by the soldiers here, the Wilderness Wolf Riders near the perimeter had a chance to escape. Of course, the number of Wilderness Wolf Riders who managed to escape wouldn't be too high, but given the enemy's tracking skills, they were indeed a huge threat. Tang In said in a low voice, "Don't worry, I've already arranged for Luke to be at the back of the team." Phew, that's good. With Brother Luke at the back, I doubt they'll dare to chase after us. Eltek and Tara were both well aware of Luke's godly archery skills. Hearing this, they heaved a sigh of relief. Fry nodded and continued solemnly, "One more thing. Regardless of how those damned Wilderness Wolf Riders manage to track us, we can't ambush the barbarians anymore. As we move forward, we have to clean up any obvious traces." Both Eltek and Tara nodded, and Tang didn't have any objections. Just as he had said to David before, their team couldn't take any more unexpected situations. They were lucky enough to survive this time, but they might not be so lucky next time. After pondering for a while, Eltek frowned and asked, "Then what about our food? Find in the mountains, hunt for wild animals, or dig up wild vegetables?" Fry looked at the soldiers behind him with a slightly gloomy expression. He sighed and said, "Sigh, we're no longer the same team as before." Eltek and Tara opened their mouths when they heard this. Pain flashed across their faces as they reacted. That's right, they weren't the same 600 people as before. If they were still at that scale, they would have no choice but to attack the barbarians in order to get more food. But now, they were only 200 people. They should be able to survive by relying on the wild animals in the mountains. Following this, the team was still heading east, but their route had changed greatly. Basically, they didn't have to go through mountain roads anymore. Instead, they had to travel through the mountains and forests. This way, the journey was undoubtedly longer, and they had to take many detours. Moreover, it was quite difficult to travel. But there were two advantages. First, it wasn't easy to expose their tracks in such an environment. Second, they could take the opportunity to find some food. Such conditions were undoubtedly difficult. Now that it was winter, it was the time when wild animals returned to their nests to rest. It was difficult to be lucky enough to find a black bear's den like before. So now, the soldiers were basically vegetarians. As long as they could distinguish which plants were edible and which were not poisonous, they would not hesitate to eat them. It was not about the taste, but about hunger and life. At this time, the soldiers began to remember the days when they were tired of eating meat every meal. The barbarian meat didn't taste good, but at least it was oily and could fill their stomachs. It was not like now. Either they ate something bad and their stomachs were burning, or they couldn't eat anything and their stomachs were empty. Compared to the miserable soldiers, Misho's current condition was better. He had meat soup to drink every meal. David fulfilled his promise. No matter when, whether it was pheasants or guinea pigs, he could always find one. However, although the nutrition kept up, Micho's wound was eventually infected and caused some physical diseases. The short spear was thick, and such a big wound, coupled with the hellish environment at that time, it was almost inevitable that he would be infected. In the past few days, Micho's body had been unusually hot and cold. For this situation, Tang En was helpless. There was a prescription, which Tang En found from the well-read old housekeeper. But the corresponding herbs were a big problem. Even if David took the risk of expanding the range and frantically searching, they still couldn't find all the herbs. This kind of situation was inevitable. Every kind of herb had its own habits, and the environment it grew in was also different. It was undoubtedly impossible to find all the right herbs in one place. However, Micho's condition could not be delayed any longer. Tang En had no choice but to enter the space again and ask the old housekeeper to make a medicine based on the limited number of herbs he had. The old housekeeper was indeed very helpful. Once again, he threw out a prescription. However, the medicine made according to this prescription was not the right medicine. It could only temporarily stop the deterioration of Micho's condition. At this point, Tang En didn't care much and immediately made a medicine for Micho to take. The result was as the old housekeeper said. Micho's condition was greatly alleviated, but he was still weak and couldn't move. Seeing this, Tang En made up his mind. While looking for herbs, he also asked David and the others to investigate and see if they could find barbarian troops in the surroundings. Medicine was an essential resource for the army. Even if they ran into the army of tens of thousands of barbarians from before, Tang En was willing to accept it. Tang En was busy treating Micho with the gray space, while Fry, Eltek, and the others led the team to find food and get rid of the barbarians behind them. Frey's previous worry was right. When the team first set out, there were indeed a few barbarian wolves chasing them. But as soon as they entered the range of the team, they were ambushed by David and the others. None of them escaped. There was a small episode. Naturally, no one cared about the barbarian corpses, but the barbarian wolves were brought back by David. They were skinned and had their tendons pulled out, which finally satisfied the soldiers' cravings. After killing the barbarian wolves, the team was not pursued or attacked for the next few days. However, they didn't dare to be careless. The barbarian wolves were famous in the north and the south, but now hundreds of them were burned to death. This kind of humiliation was impossible to swallow. So now, the most likely possibility was that the barbarians were frantically searching for them in places where Tang En and the others couldn't see. However, this had little to do with them. After a few days, the team finally arrived at the edge of the wilderness. At this time, David suddenly turned around and grabbed Tang En's arm tightly. He shouted that Micho was saved. Chapter 5:22. All right, let's move our sight away from Tang En, who was hiding in the ravine like a barbarian, and look towards the southeast. Noon in the vast canyon. Angry roars, the sounds of killing, the sounds of weapons clashing. Under the gloomy sun, the crowd surged and blood splattered everywhere. There was no doubt that there was a war going on here that was expected and unexpected. It was expected because this was the front line. Battles big and small were more common and frequent than a normal person's 3 meals a day. It was unexpected because this was the Zechen Legion's territory. As the most powerful legion in the brand, the Zechen Legion had been guarding the front line for decades and had never allowed the northern wilderness tribes to take a step forward. With such a reputation, no one dared to provoke them. But looking at the current situation, it was obvious that someone had the guts to go against the wind. The canyon's terrain was vast, and there were simple checkpoints at both ends. But now, the checkpoint at the front had been turned into broken wood and gravel and was trampled under the feet of the barbarians. The checkpoint at the end was also in danger. The soldiers wearing the Zechen Legion's standard armor retreated step by step and were about to lose this military stronghold. Of course, this was also the result of the situation. The Zechen Legion was famous and the quality of the soldiers was naturally strong. But unfortunately, They did not have the advantage in numbers and only had about 2,000 people. It could be said that if it were not for the restriction of the canyon's terrain, they would have been drowned by the barbarians in an instant. Attack, attack, press, all of you press, push forward and take off the last layer of underwear. Ha, this feels so good. In the middle of the barbarians, the young man riding on the giant wolf was like the commander of an orchestra. He was dancing with joy, and his face was abnormally red. From time to time, he would raise his head and laugh. His words were arrogant and rude, as if he was crazy. Of course, he had a reason to be arrogant. In a situation where they had such an advantage, the crumbling checkpoint on the other side of the canyon was indeed like the last layer of underwear on a woman's body. Although it tried to cover it up, it was only a matter of time before it was taken off by the barbarians. Being able to crush the Zechen Legion in such a manner undoubtedly gave this young man a great sense of accomplishment. He shook his head and said, "Haha, you don't live up to your name. You don't live up to your name. The so-called Zechen Legion is just SOSO, huh?" There was a middle-aged barbarian officer beside the young man. The corners of his mouth curled up as he looked at the battle before him. He nodded in satisfaction. However, after hearing these arrogant words, he couldn't help but frown. "Tiu, we are only at the periphery of the Zechen Legion. The enemy might not be able to react in time. We must not be careless. Enough. Uncle, you're so boring. I'm obviously just trying to provoke him, hoping that the other party's storm will be even fiercer." Tiu waved his hand disapprovingly. Then he shouted at the Zechen Legion soldiers, "Why are you still struggling? Hurry up and run back. Tell that Z what's his name. Tell him that he disappointed your great master Tiu." When the commander was humiliated, the soldiers naturally felt the same way. Moreover, this was the famous military god Z in the northern wilderness. As soon as Tiu finished speaking, a few angry roars came from the Zechen Legion soldiers who were retreating. "Oh, you're not happy with what I said? You dare to shout at me? Hey, don't say that you didn't give me a chance. Your great master Tiu is standing right here. Why don't you come and bite me?" After mocking the group, Tiu smacked his lips. He turned to the middle-aged barbarian and complained in a low voice, "Uncle Yuan Fong, it's not that I want to say this, but the Zechen Legion's reaction is really too slow. We've already conquered more than 10 checkpoints in the past 2 days, right? Even if they don't expect that Z to personally come and fight with me, they should at least send a general to give me a good time. Really?" He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Do I have to rush into the hinterland and give them a hard time? Absolutely not." Yuan Fong was shocked when he heard this. He hurriedly said, "It's a big taboo for an army to go deep into the enemy territory alone. Don't make these tens of thousands of warriors suffer. Look at how scared you are." "I'm just kidding," Tiu pouted and said gloomily. "Then what do we do now? Do we still fight like this?" Tiu couldn't be blamed for being gloomy. Since 2 nights ago, when he led the army to attack the Zechen Legion's defense area, they had been wandering around the periphery. They had destroyed more than 10 checkpoints, but the enemy didn't seem to have heard anything and didn't respond at all. It was naturally abnormal for them to be so submissive. Tiu never lacked confidence in himself, but he was definitely not arrogant enough to think that the enemy was afraid of him. On the other hand, Tiu felt that he was being ignored. He was like a dog that kept circling around his master's legs. When the master finally got annoyed, he threw a bone and let the pestering dog go play by itself. Even if his uncle could tolerate this, his aunt couldn't. Tiu came here with great ambitions. Even if he was defeated by Z, this trip wasn't in vain. If he went back like this, how would he answer if someone asked? "Oh, I went to the Zechen Legion's defense area, but I went around the periphery to train my courage and came back." That's T. The enemy might have some kind of trap by doing this. It's just that we haven't figured it out yet. Compared to the hot-blooded and ambitious Tiu, Yuan Fong was more cautious and pragmatic. He didn't dare to let his guard down against the tribe's biggest enemy, Z. "You've said this more than 10 times already. Please say something more practical." Tiu touched his forehead and said helplessly, "We're now at the periphery of the Zechen Legion's defense area. Our target is very random, so it's impossible for us to be surrounded. And behind us is the Thunderbolts Army's checkpoint on the other side of the mountain range. We left 3,000 people there, so there's no danger of us being cut off. Tell me, other than this, what other trap could the enemy have? This analysis was reasonable and well-founded, and Yuan Fong was speechless. But then he looked at Tiu cautiously. No matter what, we can only move around the periphery. If we can successfully lure the enemy out, I'll let you fight. But if the enemy doesn't come out, don't even think about going deep into the defense area. Tiu's face froze when he heard this. It was obvious that his intention had been guessed. He couldn't help but mutter, "Damn old man, he's so damn vigilant." What? Yuan Fong frowned. "Oh, nothing. Woola." Just as Tiu waved his hand to deny it, a deafening cheer came from the front. The two of them looked up and saw that the simple checkpoint at the back of the canyon had been forcefully pushed down by the barbarians. Wood and stone flew everywhere, and a large amount of dust was raised. At this time, the 2,000 Zechen Legion soldiers had already retreated out of the canyon in an orderly manner. Just like the previous few times, they didn't waste any time and immediately gave up on the stronghold and retreated into the defense area. The barbarians at the front didn't receive any orders to pursue, so they stopped and gave up after seeing that they didn't gain any advantage. Tiu curled his lips when he saw this. He waved his hand and said coldly, "Let's go and continue to the next checkpoint." "Humph. Z. Oh, Z. I don't believe that you'll remain indifferent after we've cleared all your outer defense lines and stripped off all our skin." As soon as he finished speaking, the vanguard wolves moved forward. Yuan Fong let out a sigh of relief when he heard this. Tiu was really unreasonable when he went crazy, but as long as they didn't go too deep, there shouldn't be any big problems. Thinking of this, he ordered the army to continue advancing back to the battlefield. While Tiu and the others were doing dangerous things, Tang Yin and the others were sitting on top of the mountain and watching the tigers fight. They were very close to the edge of the wilderness. According to the information sent back by the gray space, they could escape as long as they walked forward for 7 or 8 miles. Although they were out of the wilderness, it didn't mean that the danger was completely over. After all, they had walked more than half of the journey, and the light of escape was not far away. Therefore, everyone was in a very relaxed mood at this time. But at this time, they discovered the situation. Boom, boom, boom. Crawling on top of the mound, Tang In, Fry, and the others listened to the earth-shattering explosion outside. They carefully poked half of their heads out from under the cover of the rocks. Below the mound was a large open space with rugged rocks. Occasionally, there were tall holly trees among them. It had a unique feeling of the wilderness. But now, this place was suffering under the tyrannical power. As long as one was sucked into it, they would immediately be swept away by the dust and sand. It was a complete mess. There weren't many people fighting, but there was no doubt that they were all experts. On one side, there were 5 people, led by a white-bearded old man wearing a gold-rimmed white robe and holding a magic crystal staff. Around him, there were 4 guardian knights wearing bright silver armor and waving long spears. Their strength was not low. The white-bearded old man belonged to the category of magicians. Tang Yin didn't know much about him, but looking at the large, sword-shaped white light scattered by his hand, he knew that he was at least a senior magician. As for the other knights, from the light of their do chi, it was certain that they should be close to the level of senior warriors. Whether it was the white-bearded old man or the guardian knights, Tang Yin and the others were very familiar with them, because they were wearing the signature attire of the Brand Temple of Light. David was excited before, so he lowered his voice and pointed to the white-bearded old man. "Boss, this old man can definitely cure me show." Tang Yin heard this and nodded. His heart was ecstatic. Just when I was about to doze off, someone sent me a pillow. Everyone knew that the clergy of the Temple of Light were good at healing. Michaud didn't have a terminal illness. It was just a small illness caused by an infection. The old man's strength was obviously not low, so he could definitely cure Michaud. "Don't make a move. Let's watch first." Tang Yin suppressed the joy in his heart and said calmly in a low voice. Then he turned his attention to the few people who were fighting with the Temple of Light. They were 3 middle-aged men dressed in black with cold faces. Although they were at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, they had the absolute upper hand. Black chi filled the sky as soon as he attacked, and it turned into ferocious demonic beasts in the shape of snakes and wolves. The few people from the Temple of Light obviously could not withstand such a strange attack. Apart from the white light of the white-bearded old man, which made the black-robed man slightly hesitate and dodge, the fighting light of the few knights could not tear through the almost solid black gas of the demonic beasts. They could only fight and retreat at the same time, guarding their vital points. It was obvious that defeat was only a matter of time. The attack and defense of the two sides were very fast, and in a moment they were heading south. However, when they were about to leave Tangen's line of sight, one of the guardian knights couldn't hold on any longer. He screamed and threw out his spear, but his body was instantly penetrated by the black gas. Then his body shrank at a speed visible to the naked eye, as if his internal flesh and blood were being devoured. The death of the knight didn't have any impact on the battle. The battle was still going on, but the location was no longer in this open space. However, when the knight fell, his head happened to be facing Tangen's direction. His face and nose were sunken, and his eyes were empty. He looked like a weathered corpse, which was very horrifying. Eltek and Taka gasped when they saw this. They subconsciously looked away, and their cheeks twitched a few times. They had seen many dead people, but this kind of strange way of dying in an instant still shocked them. Frey's face was also extremely gloomy. After a while, he exhaled and looked at everyone, pursing his lips. It's the savage wilderness cult. Eltek and Taka grinned. Obviously, they had heard of this before, but now that they saw the other party's methods, they were still a little frightened. Twain nodded thoughtfully when he heard that. After he came to the north, he had dealt with the savage cult a few times. The attack method of the black gas snake just now reminded him of someone. A few months ago, he had gone to Hansui City with Bosco and the others to buy a defensive artifact. It was at that banquet that he accidentally bumped into Sessman and Sylvia, who had come to receive a reward. In the end, an old man named Dao, who claimed to be from the hidden snake tribe in the northern wilderness, sought revenge on Sylvia at the banquet, and both parties fought. Dao's attack was also a black gas snake. Of course, Dao's strength was much higher than the middle-aged man in black. The last Hydra move made Tangen shudder when he thought about it. Should we save them? Eltek hesitated for a moment and finally asked hesitantly. Anyone could see that the people from the Temple of Light couldn't hold on any longer. If there were no accidents, they would be lying flat in half an hour at most. As for the people from the Temple of Light, military personnel like Eltek were still very respectful. This wasn't only because of their noble status, but also because they were here to save the dying and heal the wounded. However, their current situation made them hesitate in their rescue operation. After fleeing for their lives, they only had about 200 soldiers left, and they couldn't afford any more casualties. The strength of the 3 men in black was obvious. If they tried to save them, it was inevitable that they would lose their lives. Tangen curled his lips slightly. He didn't agree with Eltek's words, but he had his own plans now. So he raised his eyebrows and suddenly asked, "What's up with those people from the Savage Evil sect? Are there many people like them at the front line?" "There are, but not many." Fry glanced at Eltek and Taka and said slowly, "I don't know what the situation at the front line is like now, but more than 10 years ago, there were still such experts from the Savage Evil sect. They usually stayed in the barbarian army and didn't make a move easily. If they did, they would only find trouble with the people from the Temple of Light. In fact, on the battlefield, their strength is limited no matter how strong they are. If a round of arrow rain can't kill them, a few rounds of arrow rain can nail them into hedgehogs. What's more, there are things like Mjolnir." Pause for a while continued. "Of course, there are also those who act alone. Because they are very strong, they carry out missions that are similar to reconnaissance in the hinterland. This is also the most troublesome. With their strength, the defense line won't be able to stop them from invading. Once the patrol team bumps into them from the rear, if there are many soldiers, they can use arrows to suppress them. But if it's a small patrol team, then it depends on their mood. If they want to kill, the only thing we can do is to send out a signal and disperse the team. Everyone will choose a direction to escape in, and those who survive will be counted. After escaping this disaster, those who survive will report back to their superiors and let the people from the Temple of Light or the experts from the army come and eliminate them. Eltek and Taka nodded at the same time and then said, "It's basically the same now, but maybe because we're in a passive position, it's hard to meet such people." The last time I saw them was a few years ago. Tang Yin nodded thoughtfully, as if he was thinking, but in his heart, he wanted to slap himself. There were restrictions on traveling in the military camp, and the things that he could come in contact with were really limited. It was also difficult to inquire about Sessman. But if he caught a few people from the savage cult and interrogated them, they should have some information about him. They often dealt with the Temple of Light. Listening to the sound of the explosion gradually fading away, Tang An's eyes flashed. Then he got up and said, "Brother Fry, you go back and settle the team down first. I'll take David and the others to see if there's a chance to save someone." "Save someone?" Fry looked at Tang An with a slightly strange expression. Obviously, he didn't believe it, but then he seemed to think of something and said, "You want those people to save me, Sho?" "Yes." Tang In nodded. Then the corner of his mouth rose, and his face was very serious. And in addition to this, the Temple of Light is a blessing in the mainland. Especially on the front line, it has saved countless soldiers. Now that they're in trouble, it's my duty to save them if I can. His words were dignified and powerful. Listening to it, it was full of awe-inspiring grandeur and moved one to the core. Hearing this, Eltek and Tucker were immediately moved and said excitedly, "Good. Since that's the case, Brother Twain, let's do our part too." "Huh?" Tang In rubbed his nose, the corner of his mouth twitched, and he shook his head and said, "No, you haven't recovered from your injuries, and it's not good for you to fight again. Also, we have to sneak up on them and kill them in one shot. Brothers, sorry, you know." In other words, he was disdainful that the other party's stealth skills were not good enough. Eltek and Tucker weren't angry. They could only shake their heads and sigh regretfully. After seeing Fry and the others off, Luke came up and asked doubtfully, "Boss, are we really going to save me, Sho?" "Nonsense. We're counting on that old man to save me, Sho. How can we not save him?" Paused for a while. Tang In narrowed his eyes and sneered, "Of course, when they're both injured. Let's go and bring me Sho here. We'll catch up with them." Luke subconsciously nodded and walked back a few steps. He smacked his lips and couldn't help but hiss when he thought about it. The reason was very simple. If they were just going to save Misho, wouldn't it be better to leave Misho with the team and wait for the old man to come over? But now that they had to go through a lot of trouble to bring Misho over, well, that old man probably wouldn't be able to see Eltek and the others. Chapter 523. Torrens was depressed. As a combat-type clergyman of the Temple of Light, his status was not low. However, he was transferred to a dangerous place like the front line because he had no one to back him up. It was fine that he was transferred here, as it was an order that he could not defy. Although this place was dangerous, there were always benefits in danger. If he could take the opportunity to kill a few cultists, it might be a blessing in disguise. Hence, after thinking it through, Torrens paid close attention to the information regarding the cultists. Hard work paid off. Soon, he received information from the nearby army that the soldiers encountered the cultists while patrolling the wilderness defense zone. Torrens attached great importance to this and was very cautious. He gathered some information and studied it carefully to make sure that he could take them down easily. Hence, he did not care about the strange atmosphere in the wilderness and led the 8 guardian knights out excitedly. The cultists came here alone with a mission. It was impossible for them to stay in one place. Torrens was unlucky. His situation was similar to Tang An's. Not long after they passed through the checkpoint, the barbarians launched a large-scale attack. However, Torrens and the others were not familiar with military affairs and did not pay much attention to the barbarian squads they encountered. They only chose to avoid them and did not take the opportunity to turn back. After a few days of tracking, Torrens and the others finally discovered the whereabouts of the cultists. However, just as they were about to attack, they were shocked to find that the cultists were not alone, but in a group of 3. At that moment, the cultists also discovered them. This matter was serious. If it was only one person, Torrens was confident that with the 8 guardian knights and himself, they could easily defeat the cultists. But now that the other side had 3 great savage evil cults experts, how could they gain any advantage? Torrens did not have the time to curse the soldiers for passing on false information. He immediately ordered a retreat. However, the 3 members of the cultists did not allow him to leave. The conflict between the Temple of Light and the cultists had been going on for a long time. When both sides met, their eyes would turn bloodshot and they would fight to the death. Moreover, the cultists obviously had the advantage in strength. Hence, they did not hesitate to turn around and chase after the cultists. Actually, the soldiers couldn't be blamed for this. It was even more impossible for them to pass on false information. Originally, there was only one person, but this person had already completed his mission. Along the way, he met up with the other 2 people who had done the same thing and were preparing to retreat and return to the army. Who would have thought that Torrens would show up at this moment? Wasn't he courting death? Seeing another guardian knight turn into a withered corpse and half of the guardian knights he had brought with him had died, Torrens could not help but despair. The difference in strength was too great, and there was no way they could fight back. Furthermore, his opponent was a member of a savage evil sect. Even if he begged for mercy, he wouldn't have a chance to live. This was the difference between fighting on the battlefield and living like a prince. The depression of one's fighting spirit would often widen the gap between the strength of both sides. Due to despair and fear, Torrens was even more hesitant when he attacked. Although the knights resisted with all their might, their strength was far inferior to the enemy. Without Torrens' support, 2 more knights were turned into dried corpses in quick succession. Torrens panicked. He let out a sharp howl and held his staff horizontally in front of him. Intense light suddenly erupted from his surroundings, instantly radiating to the entire area. Even a rabbit would kick when anxious. Torrens, who was asking for death, was prepared to fight with his life. The 3 middle-aged men in black knew how powerful Torrens was, but due to the previous round of fierce attacks, they were too close to each other and could not dodge. They looked at each other and decisively abandoned the knight who was about to be killed. The 3 of them stood in a stable triangle and roared as well. They waved their hands and black gas surged out. The dazzling light converged. Torrens put his palms together and his expression was somewhat sinister. Finally, he opened his hands wide and a cylindrical light beam suddenly descended from the sky, like a ray of sunlight. However, at this moment, the 3 middle-aged men in black below also raised their hands as if they were holding a cauldron. Many kinds of materialized, demonic beasts spiraled up and roared incessantly. This was the rhythm of a decisive battle. The remaining 2 knights had just caught their breath from the previous storm-like attacks. Without hesitation, they summoned up their strongest fighting aura and charged forward with their spears. Boom, boom, boom. Trembling roars came from the intersection of the light beam and the black gas. A circle of light instantly spread out like ripples on the water. The surrounding stones and tall ancient trees crumbled as soon as they came into contact with the light beam. Rocks and trees were sent flying, and dust filled the air. The scene was a mess. Puff, puff. The 2 knights of light were the weakest. After the first tremor, they spat out blood and were directly sent flying. One of them, who was closest to the battle, directly exploded in the air. Pieces of flesh and blood instantly splashed in the air. The other knight did not end up in such a miserable state. However, he fell to the ground and rolled a few times. Only his chest was moving up and down. It was obvious that he no longer had the strength to fight. Boom! Puff! Puff! This lucky knight was not alone. While he was gasping for breath, he heard a loud explosion. Then he saw Torn's protective magic shield shatter, and he was sent flying while spewing blood. Bam! He crashed to the ground and rolled on the ground while groaning in pain. He was in a sorry state. The three middle-aged men in black on the opposite side also swayed. Blood seeped out of the corners of their mouths. They waved their hands to disperse the black gas and kept retreating. Torn's strength was not low. If the opponent was only one person, he should be able to suppress and win with his absolute strength. However, under the combined attacks of the three opponents, there was only one path for him to walk. The outcome of the battle was decided. After retreating a dozen steps, the three middle-aged men in black finally stabilized themselves. They saw Torn struggling to get up after falling to the ground. His broken staff was also thrown aside. They could not help but reveal cruel smiles. The battle was over. Naturally, the next step was to torture the opponent and vent their anger. Self-proclaimed Light's lackey. The man in the lead raised his head and laughed. He said some humiliating words and was about to step forward. However, when he took a step forward, his body suddenly stopped and he suddenly turned his head. Then, two exclamations came from behind. "Be careful!" Damn it! The warning was obviously too late. When the man turned his head, his vision was filled with black shadows of spinning arrows. They were getting closer and closer. Puff! His left eye hurt and blood blossomed. He fell backward. This change came too suddenly. Not only did the archer grasp the timing perfectly, but he was also very close to them. The arrow was shot. There was no sound, but it could not be dodged. Who is it? The two middle-aged men in black on the back could not help in time. They could only watch as their companion was shot in the head. They immediately locked on to the bushes and shouted angrily. Whoosh! 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 What answered them were 3 arrows in a triangular shape. A figure stood up from the bushes and blocked the escape route of the middle-aged man in black on the left. "You are courting death." The middle-aged man in black who was attacked roared. Now that he had the time and distance to react, he would not be hit again. He hurriedly retreated a few steps, and black gas burst out again, shattering the arrows that were coming at him. At this time, the middle-aged man in black on the right had already rushed to the bushes, and he attacked furiously with snake-shaped black gas. The one who shot the arrow was a young man in black armor. As if he did not see the approaching black gas, he shook his left hand and shot out arrows continuously. His target was still the man in black on the left who was retreating. Die! The middle-aged man in black was furious. He waved his hand and was about to shoot out black gas to kill the arrogant young man in front of him. Unexpectedly, at this time, bang! Another black figure rushed out of the bushes with dead branches and leaves. It flashed in front of the middle-aged man like a ghost. He did not see the blade, but he felt a chill in his throat and goosebumps appeared all over his body. The middle-aged man in black knew that he had fallen into a trap. He screamed and forced himself to stop moving forward. At the same time, he changed the direction of the black gas and shot it out in a futile attempt to stop the opponent from getting close. He bent one of his hind legs and jumped with force, quickly jumping backward. His reactions were quick, but when he landed on the ground, the black shadow that rushed out was right in front of him again. The blade was still pointed at his throat, followed by a wave of cold air that could freeze a person. Murderous aura. The middle-aged man in black who had experienced hundreds of battles could easily distinguish what this so-called chill was. It was noon now, and the light was dim. It was not warm, but it was definitely not cold. But now, the middle-aged man in black felt as if he had fallen into an ice cellar, and he was drenched in cold sweat. What kind of joke was this? This murderous aura. How many people did it kill? He did not have time to see who the other party was, did not have time to curse, and did not even have time to block. The middle-aged man in black was shocked and could only retreat quickly. Retreat again, and continue to retreat. However, after 10 steps, the black figure followed him like a shadow, and its speed was even faster. The blade was only inches away from his throat. No, I can't go on like this. The middle-aged man in black knew that there was no hope of dodging, so he steeled his heart. He leaned his upper body and tilted his neck slightly. Risking both sides being injured, he attacked the black figure's head with a burst of black gas. What a pity. The middle-aged man in black overestimated his attack speed, or it could be said that he underestimated the opponent's running speed. The black figure continued to move forward and increased its speed by a bit. In a flash, it appeared in front of the middle-aged man in black. With a flip of its right hand, the dagger was aimed at the man's forehead. There was no doubt that before the black gas hit the target's head, the dagger would have already pierced through the man's forehead. It's over. The middle-aged man in black, who was leaning back, had no way to dodge. Time seemed to have slowed down at this moment. He could only watch the tip of the dagger slowly fall. Roar! A violent roar suddenly came from not far away. The middle-aged man in black subconsciously turned his eyes. In his peripheral vision, he saw that his companion was being attacked by several people in black armor, and the situation was very dangerous. Suddenly, needless to say, the arrow of the black-armored youth was just a pretense. The purpose was to force his companion to step back and step into the encirclement. The dagger was already at his head while he was thinking. Puff! The middle-aged man in black felt a pain in his forehead, and the last trace of his consciousness disappeared. He fell into the eternal abyss of darkness. Chapter 5:24. In 1 minute, the situation of the battle was completely reversed. When the dizzy Torrens finally got up, he paused for a while at the scene before him. He blinked in disbelief and unconsciously wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Suddenly, he felt that his brain was still in a daze. Of the 3 savage, evil cultists, only one had entered the forest and was out of sight. It seemed that he was being besieged by many people. As for the other 2, one of them had his head pierced by an arrow and was lying on the ground. One of them leaned back, and the dagger between his eyebrows slowly slid down until the full appearance of the dagger on his forehead was revealed. Then puff! Red, white, gray, and yellow blood mixed with some sticky substance spurted out. The scene was extremely bloody. As if he sensed something, the owner of the dagger, a young man with an extremely ordinary face, calmly stepped back and left the range of the multicolored liquid. He then turned his head and looked over. In the next second, he waved his right hand that was holding the dagger as a greeting. His smile was kind and bright. Gulp! In the wilderness at noon, the gloomy sun was trying its best to emit warm rays of light. Everything was normal, whether it was the other party's action of rescuing him or the smile that represented goodwill. But for some reason, Torrens subconsciously swallowed a mouthful of saliva. It was as if a bottomless spring had suddenly calmed down and a chill was constantly drifting in his heart. He's coming. Before Torrens could figure out the source of these inexplicable emotions, his heart suddenly trembled. He saw the young man first turn his head and look at the small forest behind him where the sounds of battle came from, and then walk over. When the young man approached, he touched his nose as if he was organizing his words. Then he placed his hand on his chest and made a few gestures, performing a strange salute, and introduced himself. Greetings, sir. I am the battalion commander of the Heavy Sword Battalion of the Thunder Army, Tang In. Are you a sir from the Temple of Light? Torrens' eyes flickered. That strange salute was an exclusive salute for believers when meeting a clergyman of the Temple of Light. He couldn't help but feel slightly relieved. He nodded and smiled. I am the second-ranked deacon of the Temple of Light, Torrens. Hee. Thank you for saving me, Battalion Commander Tang. Then he glanced at the corpses of the 2 savage, evil cultists, his eyes still somewhat suspicious. This was because Tangin's skills were too high. Although Torrens wasn't able to see the battle clearly due to his dizzy state, it was an indisputable fact that the 2 cultists were dead. How could a battalion commander or soldier accomplish such a feat? Tang, and also looked back and scratched his head. He also had a puzzled look on his face. Are these people from the savage cult? It's a little different from the rumors. Just now, when I saw that you were in a critical situation, I boldly launched a sneak attack. I didn't expect to kill 2 of them so easily. Sneak attack? Torrens glanced at the evil cultists who had been shot in the head. Realization dawned on him. Although he still had doubts in his heart, they had lessened a little. Before he could think further, Twain had already walked to the side and helped the heavily injured knight up. After sizing him up, he could not help but say anxiously, "Sir, this Sir Knight doesn't seem to be able to make it. Please come over and take a look." When Torres heard this, he became anxious. Clergy like him would be assigned some guardian knights by the Holy Church after reaching a certain height. In a sense, these knights were his private property and would be loyal to him for the rest of their lives. It was precisely because of this that Torrance spent a lot of effort on these guardian knights. He not only bought them high-grade armor, but also thought of ways to increase their strength. But who would have thought that 8 of them would almost be wiped out this time? How could Torrance not feel distressed? After taking a few steps forward and coming to the side of the blood-stained knight, Torrance's face darkened. He quickly crossed his hands and made a few mysterious gestures in front of him. He muttered a few words, and suddenly, a soft milky white light was emitted from his palms and directly shone on the knight's body. The knight was seriously injured, but the most serious injury was caused by the shock wave just now. It was an internal injury. Tangan didn't know whether the internal injury had healed or not, but in his sight, the wounds on the knight's body were quickly closing up. His pale face also eased a little. It seemed that he had recovered a little. Seeing this, Tang narrowed his long and narrow eyes and couldn't help but smile. Michaud could be saved. The milky white light soon disappeared. This kind of treatment seemed to consume a lot of Torn's energy. In just a short 10 seconds, his face quickly darkened, as if his vitality had been greatly damaged. Tangan asked with concern, "Sir Deacon, how are his injuries?" Shaking his head, Torn's face was still as gloomy as water. "It's hard to say. He won't die for the time being." The shock wave just now was so powerful that even Torrance himself suffered a backlash, let alone this guardian knight who had yet to reach the advanced warrior realm. The loss this time was too great. "Oh," Tang nodded. Then, as if he thought of something, he asked, "By the way, Sir Deacon, do you know Sir Sessman?" Torrance raised his eyebrows and asked in surprise, "Inspector Sessman? You know him?" It seemed that Sessman's status was higher than Torrance, so Torrance paid more attention to Tangan. "Yes, it was a year ago." Tangan's expression was reminiscent as he said respectfully, "At that time, I was lucky enough to meet Sir Sessman and received his blessing." "Haha, now that I think about it, I was really lucky. Well, I wonder where Sir is now? Do you still have a chance to listen to the gospel closely?" Hearing that it was just a blessing, Torrance frowned slightly. His tone became indifferent again as he said casually, "I heard that he is with the Ashen Flame Legion. I don't know the details." Ashen Flame Legion? No wonder Eltec and the others couldn't get any information. Tangan's eyes flashed, but he quickly covered it up and patted his forehead. He looked a little anxious. "Look at me, I was just chatting." He rubbed his palms and hesitated. Finally, under Torn's doubtful gaze, he gritted his teeth as if he had made up his mind. He waved his hand behind him, saluted, and pleaded, "Sir, one of my soldiers is seriously injured and seems to be sick. Please help him." While speaking, 2 members of the Gray Space carried the unconscious Michaud over on a stretcher. Torrance couldn't help but frown. He was seriously injured and the treatment just now had consumed a lot of energy. Naturally, he didn't want to take the risk to treat an ordinary soldier. Of course, his life was saved by Michaud, so he still had to act on the surface. Thinking of this, he shook his head with a heavy expression and sighed. "Alas, Battalion Commander Tang, saving lives and healing the wounded is the duty of a clergyman. Even if he didn't ask me, I would have taken the initiative to save him. But right now, I don't have the strength. Why don't you wait a few more days until I've slightly recovered from my injuries and then treat your soldier?" "Damn it, you're courting death." His long and narrow eyes narrowed, and an undetectable murderous intent flashed in them. Tang secretly sneered a few times. He moved his hands behind his back and made a few gestures. On the surface, he showed a reluctant expression. He looked at Michaud and said anxiously, "Sir, my brother's injuries are too serious. I'm afraid he can't wait for more than a few days." You see, hearing this, Torn's face instantly sank. A member of the Temple of Light, like him, had a high status. Not to mention a small battalion commander, even the regiment commander had to be polite to him. Now, Tangan's words, which sounded like coercion, naturally aroused his disgust. But before Torrance could say anything, suddenly, a few screams suddenly came from the forest not far away. It sounded very horrifying. Hearing this, Torrance's face changed greatly. Damn it. How could I forget that there are still 2 savage cult experts who are not dead yet? According to Twain's explanation, the 2 people from before were ambushed by them and luckily killed by luck. But now, the remaining savage cult expert had avoided the sneak attack. How could these soldiers stop him when he went all out? Tang, and also panicked. What's going on? How is this possible? Didn't the previous 2 savage cult experts die easily? Quick, go and take a look. As he spoke, he sent the 2 members of the gray space to the forest. Battalion Commander Tang in. Why don't you go and take a look? Torn's reaction was quick. He was injured and couldn't fight, so he turned his attention to Tang in. Whether it was a sneak attack or not, one of the savage cult members was indeed killed by him. This showed that Tang in still had some strength. Me? I can go. But, well, glancing at the unconscious Michaud, Tang in dilly-dallied on the ground. Damn it. Seeing this, Torrance understood the other party's intention. The corner of his mouth twitched a few times, and his heart was filled with anger. Phew! He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. After a moment, his body trembled slightly, and he forced a smile. Battalion Commander Tang in really cares about his subordinates. Well, fine, I'll go all out and treat him. Damn it, damn it, damn it. You will pay the price for this. I swear by the God of Light. Ha, thank you, sir. As if he didn't see the other party's ugly expression, Tang in was overjoyed and bowed again. Damn it, he finally took the bait. Chapter 525. Torrance snorted and ignored Tang, unsincere gratitude. He stepped forward and bent over to check Michaud's wound. It was true that light magic had healing effects, but it also had to be targeted at the illness. Not every injury could be healed with a single spell. Tang in explained, the wound is not a big problem. It's just that the wound may have been infected and caused some small diseases. I know. Torrance stood up and interrupted Tang in's words. He thought for a moment and folded his hands in front of him, ready to cast a spell. Tang in shrugged and took a few steps back. He was not angry. The milky white light was released again. It was very warm and magical. Michaud was bathed in the light. The wound on his abdomen did not change, but his rapid breathing gradually calmed down. Obviously, the healing spell was effective. However, the milky white light was slightly dimmer than the one used to heal the night. Torrance must have cut corners. Otherwise, light magic should have healed the wound. With regard to this, Twain was not surprised, nor did he protest. The biggest problem for Michaud now was the infection. As long as this was cured, everything would be fine. After all, the wound could be healed in a short time. Thinking of this, Tang in's eyes flashed, and he said excitedly, Miracle! My lord, this is really a miracle. Well, please do your best. As long as my brother is well, even if I die in battle later, I will have no regrets. The meaning of this sentence was very complicated, but aside from the exaggerated words, there was only one meaning left. You must cure my brother's infection. Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about. Torrance no longer had a good impression of Twain, so he naturally understood the meaning behind Twain's words. His face turned even gloomier, and the magic incantation that he was muttering earlier turned into curses. However, his hands were not careless, and the faint milky white glow increased by another layer. After 10 seconds, the light disappeared. Torrance's face became even gloomier. Firstly, it was because of his anger. Secondly, it was not easy for him to cast the healing spell. Taking a deep breath, he did not look at Tang in and said coldly, It's done. At this time, Tang in did not care about Michaud's tone. He quickly went forward and bent down to touch Michaud's forehead. Then, he checked his breathing. The previous symptoms of hot and cold and shortness of breath had indeed disappeared. Is it done? Michaud suddenly looked up. His face was cold, and his eyes were bloodshot. He pursed his lips and said angrily. It was just one word, but it was filled with sorrow, indignation, despair, and other emotions. In the end, the murderous aura surged in the sky. Huh? Torrance, who was caught off guard, was enveloped by the murderous aura. He felt as if he had fallen into an ice cellar. With a shocked and frightened expression, he subconsciously took a few steps back and stammered, You, what are you doing?" Taking in all the subtle expressions on his opponent's face in that instant, Tang Un's heart finally settled. Yes, he did this to deceive Torrance, to determine if there was something fishy going on. Although Tang Un had never heard of any side effects of light healing magic, it was just magic. People could talk about it. It could be said that Tang In was cunning and suspicious, but it was undeniable that most of the Temple of Light members he met before were not worthy of praise. The murderous aura was released and then retracted. The scene was still the same. The dim light and the gentle breeze made people feel that the realm of ice was just an illusion. Tang In's expression was the same. Just a moment ago, he was filled with bitterness and hatred. In the next second, he smiled kindly and nodded. "Thank you." Torrance opened his mouth and even rubbed his eyes. He was speechless. Finally, he heard the screams coming from the forest from time to time. He shook his head slightly and frowned. Now, should Battalion Commander Tang go over there and take a look? Haha, there's no need for that. I believe in my people. Tang In raised his head and laughed. From the beginning until now, the respectful attitude that he had been maintaining disappeared. His tone was relaxed and teasing. Torn's expression changed when he heard this. His expression was filled with anger. He stared at Tang In and tore off the hypocritical attitude he was trying to maintain. "Damn it, what do you mean by this?" "Sir, please calm down." Tang In looked at Torrance with a faint smile and then clapped his hands twice. Clap, clap. As soon as the clapping stopped, the screams in the forest suddenly stopped. Then, a dozen figures in black armor appeared, and their voices came from afar. "Haha, boss, what do you think of my high-pitched scream just now? Does it look like it? David, you still have the nerve to say that? Is it a scream? You are a slaughtered pig." "That's right, I can testify. Mother Faster's cur, I was right next to him at that time. That shout scared me. So much that my hair stood on end, right?" Huh. He watched as the dozen or so people joked around as they walked closer. Along the way, they even left a black figure behind. It was as if a spell had been cast on Torrance. He stood there in a daze and did not come back to his senses for a long time. "What's going on?" He then looked down and saw the abandoned black figure. He could not help but suck in a cold breath. It was the remaining member of the savage cult. In an instant, the chill in his heart began to grow slowly. He turned his head stiffly and asked, "Battalion Commander Tang, what do you mean by this?" Tang In touched his nose and spread his hands. "What do I mean? Sir, didn't you want to kill this person just now? Now, I have followed your order and killed him." Torrance was speechless. However, no matter how stupid he was, he knew that the situation was not right. He took a few steps back and said reluctantly, "Oh yes, look at my memory. Well, since the heretics have been eliminated, I will not nag you anymore. By the way, you have done a meritorious deed in eliminating the heretics. When I return, I will report this to the higher-ups of the army and the headquarters of the Temple of Light. I will also give you a commendation order." Of course, this was against his will. After all, Torrance's previous idea was to have these soldiers escort him back to the rear. However, the atmosphere was getting weirder and weirder. He only wanted to escape from here and get as far away from these dangerous soldiers as possible. Tang In gave him a thumbs up and said with a smile, "Haha, as expected of someone from the Temple of Light. You don't even blink when you are bluffing. Your psychological quality is really good." Pausing for a moment, his face suddenly turned gloomy, and his long and narrow eyes narrowed. He flipped his hand, and a dagger that was full of holes lit up, and his killing intent appeared again. "All right, since Sir is in a hurry to leave, I will reluctantly send Sir on his way. You are welcome." How could Torrance not understand the true meaning of "send him off"? He hurriedly waved his hand. Of course, just to show my sincerity." No, of course, on a mountain road, David and the others stood in place with their arms crossed. They looked at this extremely harmonious scene with a strange expression. Torrance was now seriously injured and was basically in a half-crippled state. He knew that he could not defeat these people in front of him. Seeing that his hypocritical strategy was ineffective, he could not help but despair. Then his face suddenly turned serious, and he shouted sternly, "How dare you attack the people of the Temple of Light?" Smacking his lips, Tang and casually waved his hand behind him. Hee. David chuckled and rubbed his palms. He raised his great sword and walked to the side. When he arrived in front of the only unconscious knight, he simply stabbed his sword. "Damn it! Don't! Pooh!" Amidst the exclamation, the great sword pierced through the knight's left chest. Blood instantly spurted out. The pitiful knight was directly returned to the embrace of the god of light unconsciously. Why are you doing this?" Torrens looked like he was about to collapse. He still could not figure out why the soldiers who had always been respectful to them would suddenly be so ruthless. "TCH, you were so stubborn when we asked you to cast a healing spell on me, Show. To think that we even saved you earlier. Damn it." Luke sneered and said disdainfully. Waving his hand, Tang stepped forward calmly and pointed at Torrens' gold-trimmed white robe. "The reason is very simple. I hate your clothes, and I hate the Temple of Light even more." Torrens stepped back in horror. "Hee. Do you think that reason is far-fetched? Well, I think so too. Maybe you've saved people before. Maybe you've killed people who committed heinous crimes. Maybe you're really a so-called good person. But so what? You're not the first person from the Temple of Light that I've killed, but I'm sure that you won't be the last. Lastly, thank you for saving me, Show, and thank you for telling me where Sessman is. Thank you." He bowed and saluted. Looking at the dumbfounded Torrens, the corner of his mouth rose, revealing a rather brilliant smile. Listen, the next moment, Tang was still smiling in front of Torrens, but a dagger that was full of holes had magically appeared behind Torrens' back and lightly slid around his neck. There's the sound of wind. This faint voice was the last thing Torrens heard. Of course, there was still a slight but pleasant howl of the wind beside his ears. Hiss! Chapter 5:26. On an unknown hill, there was a low, concave area. About 200 people were sitting there in boredom. Some of them were whispering and trying their best to hold back their laughter. Some of them were digging through the surrounding bushes. If they were lucky enough to find half a red berry, they would immediately throw it into their mouths and enjoy it. In such a chaotic place, it was impossible for so many homeless people to appear. But no matter if it was from their dirty faces or their tattered clothes and armor, they looked like homeless people or savages. Needless to say, they were Fry and the rest who survived. After traveling through the mountains and forests for the past few days, they had to eat their fill and eat their fill. Of course, their image was not good. "Old Ellie, what are you looking at when you wake up?" Taka was chewing on a stalk of grass as he looked up at the sun and squinted his eyes. Ellie shook his head slightly and sat back on the ground. "I'm just worried." "Huh. You know how strong the Tang brothers are. What is there to be worried about?" Taka did not seem to care. "It's not that. I am worried about our safety." Ellie scratched his head. When the brothers from the gray space were around, I didn't feel anything. Now that they are gone, why do I feel more and more worried? Taka was taken aback when he heard that. He couldn't remain calm and looked at Fry hesitantly. In the end, he got up and looked around the concave ground. Fry could only smile bitterly and said with a slightly dissatisfied tone, "I say, why don't you go stand guard? You don't have to worry here." Among the remaining 200 people, most of them were the Spear Destroyer Battalion. There were only a few real brand soldiers. The ones standing guard were naturally Frey's soldiers. I'm just kidding." Taka smiled and sat down. If it wasn't for the gray space as a comparison, the legendary Spearbreaker, led by Fry, would have been enough to give them a sense of security. However, after being on the run for these few days, David's godlike performance had quickly convinced them. Of course, now that Fry had spoken, the two naturally couldn't do such a thing. El cleared his throat and quickly changed the topic. "Well, I wonder if Brother Tang and the others can save the people from the Temple of Light? It shouldn't be a problem." Taka took over the conversation tactfully. "Although the 3 people from the Savage Cult are not weak, They definitely can't defeat the Tang brothers. With David and the rest assisting them, they won't be able to do anything. Er nodded when he heard that and said with a smile, that's right. However, if we can really save him, we will have the people from the Temple of Light join our team. At the very least, the soldiers wouldn't have to worry about getting injured. What do you think, Brother Fry? That would be the best. Fry smiled and echoed. He lowered his head slightly, and a strange expression flashed across his face. He sighed in his heart. He was afraid that those people couldn't be saved. It wasn't that Fry didn't believe in Tang's strength. In fact, it was because he knew Tang's strength too well that Fry was sure that those people from the Temple of Light were dead meat. If there were no accidents, they would either die in the hands of the savage cult or Tang's sword. Tang had never liked the Temple of Light, and Fry knew that. Moreover, Tang had revealed twice that he had an enemy to kill. The first time, he pointed to the sky, which meant that he was referring to the Temple of Light. The second time, he mentioned the location, which meant that he followed Fry to the front line. The combination of these two naturally meant that the result was self-evident. As for what he said before, because of his reverence for the Temple of Light, he was duty-bound to save people and so on. In Frey's opinion, it was a complete lie. He knew Tang's character very well. This was a person who wouldn't get up early if there were no benefits. How could he save people for such absurd reasons? Not to mention that David and the others had carried Michaud away. Thinking of this, Fry smiled bitterly and shook his head. He didn't feel anything about Tang in killing the people from the Temple of Light. After all, he wasn't a fanatical believer. He was just worried about Tang's safety after his revenge. The Temple of Light was too powerful. In a sense, it was even more powerful than the Bran Empire. This was not a lie. If a person provoked the Bran Empire, he would be hunted down by the Empire. But if he provoked the Temple of Light, it was very likely that he would be hunted down by both the Temple of Light and the Bran Empire. As they were talking, there was a small commotion outside the concave ground. Elt hurriedly got up to take a look, and his face was suddenly filled with joy. He jumped up and said, Tang and the others are back. Let's go and see. Fry also got up and squinted at Tang, who was surrounded by the crowd, and Michaud, who was still carried on a stretcher behind him. Other than that, there was no one else. As expected, when he saw Elt and Taka, Tang shook his head and said sadly, I'm sorry. It's really regrettable. When we rushed over, the people from the Temple of Light had already fought with the cultists. Both sides had suffered great losses. When we rushed over and killed those damn cultists, only the deacon was still alive. The other knights were all sacrificed. Oh! When Elt and Taka heard this, their faces instantly became sad. They made some gestures of the Temple of Light in front of their chests and prayed that the other party would return to the embrace of the God of Light. Then Taka shook his head slightly and asked, and then, what happened to the deacon? When Tang heard this, he looked even more sad. He looked up and sighed. Although the deacon was not dead, he was on the verge of death. But even in such a situation, he still struggled to get up and cast a healing spell on Michaud before he died. What a kind and benevolent man. Damn this evil cult. Speaking of this, Tang hammered his palms and grabbed his hair. His eyes were slightly red, and he almost burst into tears. The only thing we could do was to bury their bodies and pray for them. It's all our fault. If only we could have arrived in time. He choked with sobs and covered his eyes with his hands. He was full of self-blame. There was a trick to lying. Lying and telling the truth was the best way. It was true that Tang and the others buried Torrance, but of course, it was not for humanitarian reasons. Torrance's fatal wound was caused by Tang's dagger. In order to prevent future troubles, it was safer to dig a hole and bury him. As for the glorious image of Torrance, it was to divert everyone's attention. Sure enough, after hearing this, everyone was in awe. They made gestures in the direction of the Temple of Light's sacrifice and chanted the scriptures of the temple in a low voice. Among them, Fry did not come over. Not far away, the corners of his mouth were twitching, and his expression was strange. Damn, these words, these expressions, these lies are amazing. The benevolent, and glorious Torrens had sacrificed himself here. It was truly a heart-wrenching sight. But now that they had taken revenge, they felt a little comforted. After reminiscing for a while, the team set off again. This place was very close to the edge of the wilderness, and in less than 10 minutes, the group finally walked out of the wilderness after 10 days of trekking. Tang In and Fry were not clear about the situation here, so naturally, they had to rely on Eltek and Taka for the rest of the journey. The two of them discussed and decided to head southeast to a large checkpoint about 10 kilometers away from here. In their opinion, although the barbarians attacked all the military bases in the wilderness, they might not bring along this large checkpoint, which was not too far away. This was because it was completely unnecessary. This checkpoint was located at the far right of the Thunderbolts Army's defense zone, close to the Zechen Legion. Therefore, whether it was from a strategic point of view or from the point of view of the Zechen Legion's deterrence, the barbarians should not attack this insignificant checkpoint. Fry felt that it was reasonable after hearing this, so he decided to head to the large checkpoint. But after only half an hour, the team made an emergency stop again. David and the others sent news that there were barbarian patrols about 10 kilometers away, and there were quite a number of them. Tang In, Fry, and the others looked at each other and were stunned for a moment. Wasn't this checkpoint insignificant? What were the barbarians' intentions? They pinched their noses and gathered to discuss again. Eltek used his finger to draw a simple terrain on the soft ground and frowned. This is our current location. If we head further east, we will reach the Zechen Legion's defense zone. But in the middle, there is a steep mountain with a large area, and the Zechen Legion's defense zone is definitely safe, but if we don't pass through this checkpoint, the soldiers will not be able to climb over this mountain. Tang In nodded after hearing this. He now had some military knowledge. He knew that most checkpoints were built based on dangerous terrain. For example, the checkpoint in front of them must have been built on the tallest part of the mountain. In other words, only after passing through this checkpoint and walking for a while could they find a lower part of the mountain and climb over it. We can't climb over the mountain directly. Fry shook his head. We are short on food now, and the soldiers don't have much stamina. If we force our way over, there will definitely be casualties. What do you mean, Brother Fry? Fry pointed to the side of the mountain. We can climb up for a while, and then go around this checkpoint from above. Of course, we will definitely encounter barbarian patrols. But with Tang In, we have a high chance of passing through. Once we reach the back of the checkpoint, whether we want to go to the Zechen Legion on the right or return to the Thunderbolts Army on the left, we will have a high degree of freedom. Escaping shouldn't be a problem. Good idea, let's do that. Tang In, Eltek, and Taka had no objections after hearing this, and the escape route was decided. Then, the team set off again and went straight to the Eastern Mountains. Of course, if Fry knew that there was a lunatic he was familiar with who was courting death by attacking the Zechen Legion, he might not have made such a choice. That way, there wouldn't have been such a frightening moment. Chapter 5:27. To be able to become a natural barrier between two defense zones, this mountain range must be vast and lofty. Such an environment would help Tang In to break through the barbarians' defense line, but it would take a long time. All right, while Tang In continued to lead his men into the ravines for a few days, let's turn our attention to the east, all the way to the defense zone of the Ashen Flame Army. The battle situation here was still as lukewarm as before due to the opinion of the highest commander of the barbarian army. Judging from the progress of the barbarians, this place was far inferior to the progress of the barbarians at the Thunderbolts Army. However, the commanders of the Ashen Flame Army, who knew the inside story, would not think so. They looked at the barbarians' progress on the map and shook their heads speechlessly. It was too stable, so stable that it was impeccable, so stable that it made one feel hopeless. On the map, the barbarian army had occupied all the important points, almost forming a horizontal line. If they attacked, it would be silent and they would advance together. If they defended, it would be an impregnable fortress. They did not pursue the results of the battle. nor did they care about the speed of their advance. They would choose their target and take it down gently. They would have a short buffer period to fully digest the results of the battle without leaving any loopholes. Such an attack method would be extremely slow in terms of advancing speed. However, if there was a change in the situation with such a stable rear, it would not turn into a complete defeat. To make an analogy, the barbarian army here was like a towering ancient tree. It was hard to see how it was growing on the surface, but its roots had been firmly planted deep into the Earth's core, spreading endlessly. 3 days later, in the afternoon, in the middle of the barbarian army, a large group of barbarians had successfully taken over a small town. The city gate had not collapsed, but there was a hole in the northern wall. Without a doubt, the barbarians had officially entered the town from here. There were corpses of different shapes and sizes lying on top of the wall. Some were barbarians, but most of them were brand soldiers who were wearing standard armor. Black smoke rose from everywhere, and there were occasional cries and groans. The battle had completely come to an end. The barbarians in the north had opened the city gate from the inside to welcome the large group of barbarians behind. Outside the town in the south, there were a few brand soldiers who looked at the town that no longer belonged to them. They lowered their heads and left in anger. At this moment, outside the northern city gate, dozens of blood-stained barbarians had formed a circle and seemed to be driving something away. The so-called town naturally had civilians. Although this was a precarious battlefield, there would always be some civilians who would stay behind for various reasons. Perhaps they were old and didn't want to die in a foreign land, or perhaps they had relatives who were serving as soldiers in the city and didn't want to leave because they were worried the barbarians had surrounded a few hundred civilians who had been driven out of the city. Most of them were old, weak, sick, and disabled, but there were also some young and strong men. They tightly gripped their sickles, pitchforks, and other farming tools. Their faces were filled with fear as they protected their loved ones behind them and kept retreating. The brand's propaganda department and other departments had done a good job in dealing with the blackened barbarians. Therefore, in the hearts of ordinary people, barbarians were usually associated with violent, ignorant, and barbaric people who ate people and drank their blood. Such a description would certainly make the commoners curse and despise the barbarians in normal times. However, when they really faced it, the fear in their hearts will be magnified because of these exaggerated words and actions. Naturally, farming tools were unlikely to harm the barbarians. However, these hundreds of civilians could only rely on these tools to comfort themselves. They could barely suppress the fear in their hearts and prevent themselves from collapsing on the spot. Of course, the barbarians at the periphery didn't care about this. They looked at these toy-like tools with a playful expression and grinned. However, it wasn't because the rumors were wrong or because they had other plans. These barbarians didn't start a massacre, nor did they eat people on the spot. At most, they would make a ferocious expression and lick the blood at the corner of their mouth to scare the weak opponents in front of them to put down their farming tools. At this moment, clop, 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 the sound of horse hooves was heard. A few dozen war horses slowly appeared in the middle of the large group of barbarians. The person in the lead was an old man with a calm expression. His hair was white, and he was wearing a big leaf dragon scale armor. The barbarians who were surrounding the civilians just happened to bump into him. They didn't dare to be negligent and saluted together, in Shuai. The old man who was called in Shuai glanced over and nodded slightly. He then looked at the hundreds of civilians who were being driven away. Paused for a while, he calmly said in the standard brand language, 10 seconds. Put down the things in your hands in 10 seconds, and you can live. After he finished speaking, he stopped looking at the brand civilians who were looking at each other. He pulled the reins and rode his horse into the city. At this time, a middle-aged barbarian officer behind him seemed to have received some news. He slightly moved closer and said, "In Shuai, the town has been completely occupied." About 500 brand soldiers escaped from a south gate. The front line asked if we should pursue and destroy them. No need, and Shuai's light voice echoed in the messy tunnel of the city gate. What we need to do now is to strengthen the town's defense. Let the hundreds of brand soldiers repair the north wall first. After he finished speaking, the sound of metal falling to the ground could be heard. Obviously, the brand civilians who were gathering around finally chose to throw their farming tools on the ground. Yes, the middle-aged barbarian didn't turn around to look. He wasn't surprised at all and nodded. Oh, right. And Shuai seemed to have thought of something. He turned around and asked, "How is Tiu doing? Did Yuan Fong send any news?" As mentioned before, the reason why he let Tiu lead the army alone was because of Tiu's identity. However, the main reason was that Yuan Fong, a steady veteran, was also going with him. Yes, I just received the news yesterday. The middle-aged barbarian had a strange expression on his face. He touched his chin and said, "The reason why I didn't tell you immediately is because, they're now outside the Zichan Legion's defense area. They have already destroyed about 20 military strongholds. They're still in the Zichan Legion's defense area?" And Shuai frowned. "Didn't they arrive a week ago? Why haven't they evacuated yet?" I heard that it's because Tiu is not satisfied. Bastard. And Shuai's face darkened. The surroundings became quiet. This was the unique aura of a veteran. Who does he think he is? He took advantage of them and didn't leave. Did he want to wait for Z to finish them all? How did Yuan Fong supervise the army? The middle-aged barbarian officer immediately bowed and said, "Please calm down," and Shuai. "Oomph." And Shuai snorted coldly. His face was still gloomy. He was still angry, ignorant, and arrogant. I think it's because he hasn't learned his lesson yet. Pause for a while, and Shuai let out a deep breath. He squinted his eyes and waved his hand. "Pass down my order. Let the leftmost army approach the Zichan Legion's defense area as fast as possible and launch a probing attack." This bastard. Does he think that he can be arrogant because he has that trump card in his hand? Phew. The Empress is too much. Why don't you have to let this bastard come with us? Really? Speaking up to this point, he stopped. However, the angry expression on his face had already said something. Upon hearing this, the middle-aged barbarian trembled in fear. He was not in Shuai, so he naturally did not dare to have any disrespectful thoughts toward the Empress. He hurriedly changed the topic. Actually, Tiu has already suffered a loss previously. And Shuai raised his eyebrows. The anger on his face subsided a little. He turned his head in surprise and asked, "What happened?" Everyone, including Shuai, knew that although Tiu's actions were crazy and gave people a feeling that he was not reliable. However, since the beginning of the war, whether it was under Shuai's command or leading the army alone, he had never suffered a loss. This was an indisputable fact. Because of this, and Shuai and the others were even more eager to teach him a lesson. They wanted him to know that war was a matter of life and death. The middle-aged barbarian officer hesitated for a moment. He looked a little distressed. He spread his hands and said, "The news came from Yuan Fong. However, this matter sounds quite unbelievable. I still don't understand it. That's why I didn't immediately report it to the marshal. It's like this. When they were on their way to the Zichan Legion's defense area, they encountered some strange places in the wilderness. There were more than 100 corpses of our soldiers on the mountain roads. Moreover, the time of death was not long. Therefore, they speculated that there should be about 1,000 Bran elite troops in front of them. Well, at that time, Tiu proposed to launch a crazy attack on all the strongholds in the wilderness. Therefore, I guess that this elite troop was coincidentally out on patrol. Then, they were blocked and couldn't return. Tiu didn't care too much when he saw this. He sent out troops to encircle and annihilate them. However, these two attacks ended in failure. The last time, the enemy even pulled out the sentries and broke through. Then, not far behind Tiwu's army, the enemy killed another 100 or so of our people. It was like a provocation. Tiwu couldn't take such humiliation. In a moment of impulse, he stopped his army and sent tens of thousands of soldiers to surround more than 50 kilometers behind us. Temporarily stopped the march? Tens of thousands of soldiers surrounding 1,000 soldiers? Ridiculous. How could he do something like that? The corners of Shuai's mouth twitched a few times. He didn't hide the ridicule in his words. The middle-aged barbarian's expression became even more strange. He lowered his head and continued. This is where the problem lies. Tens of thousands of soldiers were sent out. Even after a day and 2 nights, we still couldn't find the enemy. The middle-aged barbarian raised his head and saw that Shuai was frowning again. He seemed to know what Shuai was thinking. He took a deep breath and continued. We can be sure that the enemy is inside this encirclement, because while we were searching, the enemy attacked again. They quickly killed more than 100 of our soldiers. Then, they climbed up the surrounding mountains. Then, under the watchful eyes of everyone, when we gathered our soldiers and rushed to the top of the mountain, the enemy disappeared again. It was as if they had never appeared. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The anger on Shuai's face disappeared. It was replaced by a deep frown. He was deeply puzzled. The middle-aged barbarian was the same. In fact, he was even more puzzled. He had been thinking for a long time, but he still couldn't figure it out. He believed that if this news hadn't come from Yuan Fong, and if he hadn't known that the other party wasn't joking, he would have thought that he was reading a ridiculous story. Some things didn't need to be explained in detail. No one was a fool. Tiu wasn't a fool. Yuan Fong wasn't a fool. The tens of thousands of soldiers weren't either. Therefore, there was no need to doubt that Tiu's search method wasn't right. Or there was some hidden place that they couldn't find. These were all just wishful thinking. There was only one reason for this inconceivable result, and that was that the enemy's military officer had some mysterious means. And Shuai's brows were still tightly knitted for a long time. He finally gave up thinking. He turned his head and asked, "What happened after that? You still couldn't find them?" Shaking his head, the middle-aged barbarian smiled bitterly. No. From the beginning to the end, we didn't find any trace of the enemy. We didn't even know how many people they had. T was going crazy. He used all kinds of methods, but to no avail. In the end, Yuan Fong wanted to teach Tiu a lesson. So, he didn't use a carpet search. Instead, he retreated with the army. Sigh. The middle-aged barbarian sighed. He couldn't help but shake his head. Not to mention Tiu, who was personally involved, even he, as a bystander, was going crazy. And Shuai nodded slowly. He didn't comment on Yuan Fong's decision. Instead, he frowned and said, "Blank's army actually has such a person, more than 1,000 people. Is it the commander? Well, pass down the order. Send out the Serpentis Guard to infiltrate the Thunderbolt's army's defense area. No matter what, you must find this person for me. It's best if you can kidnap him. If you can't, kill him on the spot." After a pause, his expression became solemn. "We can't let another miraculous Z appear." The middle-aged barbarian was a little stunned. Even though he thought highly of the ability of the brand officer, he didn't expect that in Shuai's heart, this person would have Zi's shadow. After coming back to his senses, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. The corner of his mouth twitched. "And Shuai, it's not over yet." And Shuai's body shook when he heard this. He slowly turned his head and said word by word, "There's more." "Yes." The middle-aged barbarian nodded bitterly. "Do you still remember that we have a whole battalion of wilderness wolf cavalry in the Thunderbolt's army's defense area? Because of the recent battles there, you ordered them to be transferred here a few days ago. There is such a thing. Well, does this have anything to do with the other party?" "Yes. If the wilderness wolf cavalry wants to come here, they have to pass through the wilderness. I don't know where Tiu found out about this. He wrote a letter and transferred 600 wilderness wolf cavalry to continue chasing those people. This bastard elite against elite? He has some brains. You call him a bastard because Tiu even dared to kidnap the people he ordered to be transferred here. He was really daring. However, Shuai's reaction was very fast. After thinking for a while, he understood Tiu's intention. It had to be said that to deal with such a small group of elite troops, using the elite wilderness wolf cavalry, who were also good at tracking, was undoubtedly the best method. Therefore, he praised him in the end. I hope his brain isn't good enough. The middle-aged barbarian's mouth twitched a few times. He spread his hands and said, 3 days later, 600 wilderness wolf cavalry successfully tracked down the other party. That's right. Only then did we find out that the other party only had 600 people. Then the wilderness wolf cavalry attacked, and the other party fled. Both sides entered a dense forest. In the end, speaking up to here, the middle-aged barbarian officer paused. His face became even more bitter, and Schweiden noticed this. He frowned and muttered the two words, dense forest. He subconsciously looked to the west. In the end, the enemy set the entire forest ablaze. 600 of them were almost completely wiped out. Only a few managed to escape. He pursed his lips and swallowed hard. Those who survived were split into two groups. One of them went back to report the news. Fortunately, if he hadn't come back, we probably wouldn't have known about this. As for the others who followed the enemy, there was no news from them. They were probably killed. He paused for a moment, then continued. The survivors were split into two groups. One of them went back to report the news. Fortunately, if he hadn't come back, we probably wouldn't have known about this. As for the others who followed the enemy, there was no news from them. After passing through the city gate, as far as the eye could see, there were scattered corpses and broken pieces of city defense equipment. It was a mess. The middle-aged barbarian, on the horse, scratched his head. His expression was like crying and laughing at the same time. It was extremely strange. 600 wilderness wolf cavalry. 600. In the end, 599 of them were killed. Huff, huff. The scene was silent. Only the biting cold wind passed through the passageway of the city gate, making a sorrowful sound. And Schweiden didn't say a word. He looked to the west. His body was like a weathered sculpture, still and frozen. On this side, the two barbarians felt Tiu's previous madness and shock. And now, Tiu was on the verge of going crazy again. Damn it, can you guys be a little more manly? Can you be a little more manly like a man? Can't you guys have a good fight with us? Can you? I don't understand. Your Zechen Legion is so famous, right? Z has the title of military god. His name is known throughout the entire Shiza continent, right? I'm just a nameless soldier who came here to ask for guidance. Can't you guys even fulfill such a small request? Hey, don't go. I'm not done yet. Please, when you guys go back, please tell military god Z that I'm begging him. You have to come. This was a battlefield that had just ended. There weren't many corpses on the ground. Instead, there were more building materials that had been pushed down. Broken wood and broken stones were scattered all over the ground. But after all, it was a battlefield. There was still a solemn atmosphere. But now, this atmosphere was completely destroyed by the heart-wrenching roar that resounded through the sky. Threats, provocations, begging. A long roar, a kind of emotion. After the roar, the battlefield instantly quieted down. The dark mass of barbarians nearby had a strange expression on their faces. The target of the roar was the soldiers of the Zechen Legion in their standard armor. They didn't seem to have heard the roar and retreated in an orderly manner. What are you guys waiting for? Gather the corpses of the brand soldiers on the ground. Find a way to gather those who are missing an arm or a leg. Also, find some wildflowers and scatter them. Finally, bring them to the Zechen Legion's defense zone. You have to be respectful. Just say that I, Tiu, would like to invite military god Z over for a chat. That's it. Go, go. Waving his arms wildly, Tiwu rubbed the messy hair on his head and walked back in a depressed manner. 7 days, an entire week. Their army had been roaming around the Zechen Legion's defense zone. Just the military bases alone had been taken down by them. During this time, Tiu had also used various tactics, such as group mockery, provocation, and even begging. But until now, the Zechen Legion still hadn't sent out a single team to fight. How could this not make Tiu, who was full of ambition, go crazy and feel so depressed that he wanted to die? He could accept any form of failure, but the only thing he could not accept was being completely ignored. Bumping into Yuan Fong, who was walking towards him in a hurry, Tiu suddenly exploded. I can't take it anymore. I want to attack. I want to break into the Zechen Legion's core. I'm warning you, don't stop me. Otherwise, I won't give Uncle any face. What's that? Chapter 528. What is it? Yuan Fong's mouth twitched a few times. He decided to ignore the impolite words just now and handed over an arrow with a cloth tied to it. The arrow was very thick. If one wanted to fly like a normal arrow, one would need a strong bow. Turning the arrow slightly, one could see a few scribbled words. These were the words of the northern wilderness, which roughly meant that it was for Tu. Just now it was shot from the opposite mountain. Yes, it almost hurt someone. Tu looked at the words on the arrow and blinked a few times. Suddenly, he became excited and grabbed the arrow. Aha! It must be a declaration of war. Ha ha! Great God of the wilderness. Z is finally moved by my sincerity, he said thoughtlessly as he untied the cloth tied to the arrow. Yuan Fong curled his lips. He didn't think that Z would be as senseless as Tu. There were many ways to declare war. All one had to do was to shout from afar. They could also send someone directly. If the two sides fought, they wouldn't kill the messenger. Why would they use such a sneaky method? Tu, I think it's time for us to retreat. You've achieved your goal. After all, who could destroy so many strongholds in the Zichan Legion's periphery and come out unscathed? Tu unfolded the cloth and didn't even raise his head. He replied disapprovingly, TSK, don't joke around. The other side didn't even put up a decent resistance and completely ignored our existence. How can this be considered a war achievement? I can't afford to lose face like this. As if he had seen something, he suddenly frowned and his voice gradually became weaker. Yuan Fong didn't notice this and continued to persuade impatiently. This depends on the perspective. Look, we did indeed destroy more than 20 strongholds of the Zichan Legion, right? The other side didn't put up any resistance, right? Of course, Z wouldn't be afraid of us. However, the current facts also prove that he indeed has some unknown concerns, which is why he didn't dare to make a move against us. He paused for a moment. So, we'd better take advantage of the situation and leave. We don't want to wait for Z to resolve his concerns and focus on dealing with us. He was long-winded, and long-winded. It had to be said that Shuai had sent Yuan Fong to Tu's side for a very specific reason. This time, Tu didn't pretend to be deaf or mute like he usually did. Instead, he suddenly took a deep breath and swallowed with difficulty. He raised his head with an extremely complicated expression. Yes, Uncle, you're right. We'll retreat now. Uncle knows that you have a strong self-esteem, but this time we have a real battle record, no matter who it is. After a while, Yuan Fong suddenly came back to his senses and looked at Tu blankly. After a while, he asked hesitantly, "What did you say?" His left hand touched his chin, and his right hand tightly crumpled the cloth into a ball. His joints were stiff and white from exerting too much strength. Tu's expression was very complicated at this time. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the hinterland of the Eastern Zichan Legion. He was a little unwilling, but more than that, he was admiring and accepting his fate. After a while, he let out a long sigh. I said, "Let's hurry up and run." Once the order was given, the tens of thousands of barbarian soldiers quickly turned around and ran in the direction they came from. This was the strength of the barbarian army. Strategic planning was the responsibility of the commander. Ordinary barbarians were mostly simple-minded and only needed to carry out orders to the letter. Take the current situation, for example. The army had won more than 20 battles in a row. Although it was only a small victory, the morale of the soldiers had indeed been raised. However, under such circumstances, the tens of thousands of barbarian soldiers didn't say anything and turn around to run when Tu gave the order. If it had been the soldiers of the brand side and the general's personal prestige wasn't enough, this order would have been questioned by the officers. Then, it would have been too late to give a detailed explanation. On the running giant wolf, Tu's expression returned to normal. At least on the surface, that was the case. He turned around and looked at Yuan Fong. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Uncle, don't you want to know why I gave the order to run away in such a hurry? That's not important." Although he had somehow gotten what he wanted, Yuan Fong was still in a good mood. He said in a relaxed manner, "The important thing is that we have finally retreated." Tu heard this and smiled bitterly. He shook his head and said, "Ha ha, I'm afraid that we won't be able to retreat in time. He didn't see Yuan Fong's surprised look and continued. Uncle, do you remember the trump card I mentioned before? Haha, it worked. It was indeed a trump card. I've been wondering what kind of trick Z would use to deal with us. I didn't expect it to be such a simple trick. Well, it was indeed effective. The trump card was the cloth just now. A small trick? What's going on? Although he was shocked by the source of this information, Yuan Fong was still confused. He couldn't help but ask about Z's small trick. With a hiss, Tiu took a light breath and said with a gloomy expression, Our stable defense is located at the large checkpoint of the Thunderbolt's army. Now, this route of retreat is about to be cut off, and we are about to be surrounded. What? Yuan Fong turned pale with fright and shook his head subconsciously. Impossible. We left 3,000 soldiers there and ordered the city defense to be repaired. It's impossible for it to be taken down in a short period of time. Moreover, we're just outside. With such a large-scale siege, it's impossible for the scouts to not notice the mobilization of the Zichan Legion soldiers. That was the logic. Attacking a city was never easy. With the advantage of the high ground and the high walls of the city, the barbarians couldn't take down the checkpoint guarded by the brand soldiers quickly. Not to mention the fact that the checkpoint was guarded by the barbarians. In order to attack the checkpoint, the number of soldiers needed to be mobilized would naturally not be small. The Zichan Legion had been passively resisting for a week and didn't have any large-scale soldiers appear. The Zichan Legion's soldiers didn't appear, but what if the Thunderbolt's army was the one attacking? Yuan Fong frowned. That's impossible. Not to mention that the Thunderbolt's army can't even take care of themselves right now. They don't have time to care about this isolated checkpoint. Even if they wanted to cooperate with the Zichan Legion to take back this checkpoint, their soldiers wouldn't be able to break through the defense line of the other armies. Furthermore, even if they did break through, we should have received the news beforehand. Tiu nodded and his eyes flashed. That makes sense. Well, what if the Zichan Legion soldiers were the Thunderbolt's army's armor and used the Thunderbolt's army's flag to go around the checkpoint? Yuan Fong's body trembled, and he was completely stunned. After a while, he turned his head stiffly, and his expression was as complicated as Tiu's. No, it can't be. I really want to say that it can't be. Tiu shrugged casually at first, but then his expression turned bitter. But that's the F***king truth. Because we were attacking the checkpoint in the wilderness, there must be many Thunderbolt's army's troops scattered around within a few hundred miles. Yes, just like the one we encountered earlier. Who would care about these scattered troops? Even if our scouts saw them, they would just treat it as normal. Hee, how ironic. We were busy attacking the checkpoint for a week, and the momentum was so F***king huge. We were worried that ZE would use some kind of incredible strategy to deal with us. In the end, ZE only used a small trick to deal with us silently. F***CK. He only changed his armor, yet he was able to find a flaw in our defenses and encircle us. We are really... He rubbed his hair and smiled self-deprecatingly. We really thought too highly of ourselves. How embarrassing. Yuan Fong was speechless. His scalp was numb, and he subconsciously looked around. He knew that the surrounding area had been explored by the scouts, so there couldn't be any enemies. However, he still felt that behind this ordinary mound, countless Purple Star Army soldiers would appear at any moment and surround them, making it difficult for them to advance or retreat. Don't look, they won't come so soon. Or even if they do, they won't surround us at this time. Tiu looked up and squinted, looking in the direction of the mountain. If I'm not wrong, the soldiers will appear and surround us when we reach the checkpoint. Hearing this, Yuan Fong became nervous. What should we do now? It's very simple. Run, the faster the better. Tiu grimaced. We're like a wild animal in a cloth bag. We have to run out before the bag is tied up. Otherwise, we will be caught like a turtle in a jar. Yuan Fong immediately nodded and understood. He then asked to confirm, this information is related to Z. Is it reliable? Uncle, I know what you want to ask, but I really can't tell you the source of this information. Tiu paused for a moment, and then said firmly, but I can be sure that this information is reliable." Yuan Fong heard this and moved away. He waved his hands at the barbarian soldiers behind him and shouted, "Quick! Quick! Quick! Run! All of you King, run!" Previously, they kept destroying the Zichan Legion's strongholds. However, it was impossible for them to go back immediately. Fortunately, Tiu's current position was not far from the mountain where they came from. Moreover, the mountain range here was relatively low, so they could cross it. Therefore, there was a spectacular scene of tens of thousands of barbarians running wildly in this boundless wilderness. There was no formation, no pursuers, there was nothing. However, these tens of thousands of barbarians acted as if they were being chased by demons. They did not even look back. They retreated in an extremely decisive manner. It had to be said that the physical strength of the barbarians was absolutely amazing. Under the rolling dust, they actually ran like cavalry. They did not stop at all. After about 3 hours, the continuous mountain range appeared in front of them. It was not possible to say that this kind of speed would never be achieved in the future, but it was definitely unprecedented in recorded history. However, at this moment, the commander of the Serpentis Guard came in front of Tiu and Yuan Fong. "General, there are brand soldiers on the mountain peak in front." Both Ti Wu and Yuan Fong sucked in a breath of cold air when they heard this. They looked at each other and saw the panic on each other's faces. Could it be that the Zichan Legion had realized that something was wrong and had moved in advance? How many people? "I can't see clearly, but there should be more than 1,000. The commander of the Serpentis Guard was interrupted. Yuan Fong's face turned pale. He was anxious and scared. Should? How did you do your reconnaissance? How the hell did you confirm that there were only 1,000 of them?" The commander of the Serpentis Guard, who was covered in spit, was dumbfounded. He muttered, They're holding spears, heavy swords, and battle axes. They should be the group of people that we did not catch in the wilderness. Isn't there 1,000 of them?" Chapter 529. Life was like a tea table filled with cups and cups. Tang Yin knew that his luck had always been bad. Normally, he was an outsider who would provoke the local gods from time to time. Naturally, he was not favored by the goddess of luck. But as the saying goes, fortune and misfortune come hand in hand. Previously, he was schemed against by his own people. Then he was chased by the bloodthirsty lion. Then he was surrounded by tens of thousands of barbarians. And finally, he almost perished together with the wilderness wolf cavalry. No matter how he looked at it, the number of disasters was definitely enough. All right, let's take a step back. He did not want good luck as long as he was safe. But it was clear that the overwhelming number of barbarians in front of him was telling Tang in that he had overestimated the goddess of luck's moral integrity and bottom line. Could it be that she will only be satisfied when she kills me? Standing on top of the mountain, Tang In rubbed his nose as his uncombed hair was constantly being teased by the cold wind. The reason why they appeared here was naturally because they had broken through the checkpoint's defensive line. In fact, this was indeed the case. Because the mountain was high and the road was steep, plus they had to avoid the barbarian patrols. They had just broken through the defensive line yesterday and reached a safe area. After that, Tang In, Fry, and the others gathered together to discuss what they should do next. Logically speaking, after passing through the checkpoint's defensive line, they could directly turn west and return to the Thunderbolt's army. But in reality, things were not that simple. They had been in the ravine for more than 10 days and were completely unaware of the situation outside. So if they returned, they would not be able to determine their destination. And the reason for this situation was because of the barbarians' large-scale attack in the wilderness. Tang In and the others now only knew that the Thunderbolt's army situation was not good, but they did not know where the barbarians were. So where was the safest place? There were only two paths, either left or right. Since it was too dangerous to go to the Thunderbolt's army's defensive area, they could only go to the Zichan Legion's defensive area. This would undoubtedly take a long detour, but it was better in terms of safety. In the eyes of Fry, Eltek, and the others, the Zichan Legion's defensive zone was absolutely safe. They only had about 200 people left, and they couldn't withstand any form of torment. In Tangen's opinion, going to Zechen Legion was not a bad idea. Although Michaud had recovered from his illness, he did not have an abnormal body like Tang Yin. The short spear had caused great internal and external injuries to his body, and it would be impossible for him to recover in a short period of time. Furthermore, this was the front line. It was not safe to be in the midst of chaos. Therefore, Tang Yin decided to find a city nearby and arrange for a few people to send Michaud back to Dawn City to recuperate. In the end, the commanders of the team came to an agreement and decided to head to the Zechen Legion's defense zone. At that time, they were not too far away from the checkpoint. In order to ensure their safety, the team walked forward for a while before turning east and crossing the large mountain range. Because they were basically safe, David, who had been acting as scouts, also retreated. They were the ones who played the most important role in this life of running for their lives day and night. But they were also the ones who suffered the most. So they couldn't hold on any longer. After walking safely for half a day, they finally saw the light of hope. They finally reached the peak of the mountain. But they didn't even have the time to raise their heads and roar in joy. They were so happy that they had survived the calamity. But they were dumbstruck when they saw a black mass of barbarians approaching them with a cloud of dust. Everyone rubbed their eyes. This was not the first time. However, the spectacular and disastrous scene in front of them did not disappear like a dream. Instead, as the barbarians got closer, it became more and more real. It was bloody and real. Gulp. Run, run, run. Let's run. With trembling lips, Eltek's body was like a weak willow in the wind. He took a few steps back and swallowed with difficulty. Then, he said a complete sentence with difficulty. The barbarian army did not maintain a formation. But because of this chaotic charge, the barbarians' figures filled the eyes of the people at the top of the mountain. This force was unstoppable. Just the momentum alone could directly crush them. Not to mention these pitiful 200 people. Even if a void-level warrior stood there, he would also kneel down. Don't think about it. We can't run away. Tang Yin tried to maintain his rationality, but his throat was equally dry. He pointed at the barbarians in front of him and then pointed to the ground. This mountain peak isn't too high, but it will take at least 5 minutes to get down. Well, this is with my speed. Now, the barbarians in front of us only need 2 minutes to surround this place. Then what should we do? 2 ways. Tang Yin touched his nose and said, either we form a formation to resist and hold on for as long as we can, or we could just jump down from here and end everything. Haha, this is the most humorous joke I have ever heard. Taka laughed bitterly. When he heard that even Tang Yin did not have a way to escape, he finally gave up hope. However, the experiences and achievements along the way were enough to support him and everyone else to not collapse. He licked his lips and stretched out his finger to flick the blade of his axe. Buzz, then let's fight. At least we can kill a few barbarians. Suicide is a coward's act. I can't do it. Eltek also reversed his heavy sword and stabbed it into the ground. He then scratched his bird nest-like hair and said with a conflicted expression, we are definitely going to die. But can we not be confused? Where did these tens of thousands of bastards come from? And they're coming straight for us. Damn, we are not Z, do they have to give us face? Don't you think? After the shock, Fry, who had been looking at the barbarians, thoughtfully finally said, this scene in front of us seems familiar. Huh? Fry spread out his hands. Don't forget, there were tens of thousands of barbarians surrounding us before. And at that time, they were heading towards the east. We even guessed their intentions. We were too careless. We already knew that their commander was a lunatic, and it is normal for a lunatic to do something unimaginable. Well, including provoking the Zechen Legion. And now, look at the barbarians. Don't they look like they are running for their lives? Paused for a while, looked up and sighed. So we are just unlucky or too lucky to be here the right time. On the top of the mountain, because of Frey's words, there was complete silence. They had to admit that Frey's speculation was reasonable and should be the truth. Because of this, everyone was speechless and helpless. They were helpless because of the lunatic commander. If they had known that the barbarians' destination was here, they would never have chosen to run towards the Zechen Legion's defense area. They were speechless because of their unbelievable luck. The mountain range under their feet stretched endlessly to the south and to the north. With such a wide entrance, the barbarians actually chose to enter from here. The probability was not small compared to being struck by lightning while walking on the road. F*CK, F*CK, your mother, god of light. Such a ridiculous encounter made the local Taka unable to stand it. He looked up at the sky and cursed because of his anger. At this time, Eltek seemed to have thought of something. His eyes lit up, and he quickly said, "Since these bastards are being chased, will they not care about us?" These words made many people's hearts beat faster, but unfortunately, Fry still shook his head. Not likely. Look behind the barbarians. We are on high ground and can see more than 10 kilometers. But now, there are no signs of the Zechen Legion soldiers. This means that the barbarians retreated in time. Well, during this time, as long as they want to attack, it should be enough to kill us. As they spoke, the barbarians at the front had already entered the mountain range. The enemy must have discovered them, but they did not directly rush up the mountain. Instead, they went around the foot of the mountain and continued to advance. Of course, this did not give Tang In and the rest any hope. After all, if they were surrounded, the barbarians who entered first would have to cut off their escape route. Moreover, even if these barbarians left, the barbarians behind would still have a chance to complete the encirclement. Taking a deep breath, Fry turned around and looked at the silent soldiers around him. As you can see, this is a dead end. There is no turning back. I won't say anything about surrendering. We are soldiers. We can only die standing. We can't live kneeling. I'm sorry, I don't have the ability to lead everyone out of here. But I can promise you one thing. If you enter hell, wait a moment, I will be there. Chapter 5:30. If you're going to hell, wait a moment, I'm coming. Reality was reality, and the reason was also the reason. Frey's words did not mean to boost morale. On the contrary, it made the morale of the soldiers even stronger. Of course, with such a great disparity in strength, it was impossible for an army of desperate soldiers to win. It couldn't even be considered cutting off all means of retreat. What they could do now was to be worthy of their duty as soldiers. Fight to the death. All the soldiers were silent. Then, they raised their heads slightly, looked determined, and made a standard military salute. Everything was understood without words. Fry nodded solemnly and waved his spear. Prepare for battle. The remaining 200 soldiers were mostly people who used spears to break the formation. They immediately scattered on the mountain peak, piled stones, dug trenches, and built defensive lines. Yes, the effect was limited. It was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. It was ridiculous that they overestimated themselves. But there were often too many smart people in this world, and too few who were willing to persevere and fight to the death. For them, there was nothing to think about now. At least they tried, resisted, and did their best. That was more than enough. More and more barbarians poured into the mountain range. Some looked up at the mountain peak, but their footsteps did not stop. They were like ants. Tang In stood on the side of the mountain with his hands behind his back. His face was calm as he looked at the barbarians. As mentioned before, even a void-level warrior would have to kneel here, not to mention Tang In. But Tang In's state of mind was relatively calm. Originally, the most he would face was death. It had been almost 2 years since he came to this strange world. How many times had he gone through a bloody storm? How many times had he walked on the edge of life and death? He had long been indifferent to life and death. Of course, this did not mean that Tang In had given up hope and was waiting for death. On the contrary, it was precisely because of those experiences of life and death that his will to live was firmer than anyone else's. It was just another dance on the side of death. After a while, he got used to it. Boss. Tang In turned his head and could not help but raise his eyebrows. He saw the members of the gray space standing behind him. David seemed to have been elected as a representative. He scratched his head and came over with a flattering smile. Well, we have all discussed it. When the fight starts, we will collectively break out in one direction and send them as far as possible. Well, after that, we will see if boss can take me show out. Oh, Tang Yin grinned when he heard David's words. Although he had expected it, he still felt warm when he heard David's words. He simply nodded and said with a smile, "Well, thank you." David probably did not expect Twain to agree so readily. He did not follow the routine and was a little dumbfounded when he heard what Twain said. Haha. Tang Yin laughed even more happily when he saw David's reaction. He patted David's head, shook his head slightly, and grinned. "What are you thinking? Do you think I can kill them in this situation? Boss is wise and powerful, and your strength is unfathomable." David paused when he saw Tang and staring at him. He scratched his head embarrassedly and said in a hesitant tone, It seems that we can't kill them, but, well, we have to try." Stroking his chin, Twain nodded and said, "That's right, we have to try. Of course, we won't use the way you die." Boss, do you have a way?" "It's not a way, just a try." Twain turned around and pointed at the barbarians in front and behind them. "Brother Fry, did you hear what I said just now?" "Yes, the other party should have had time to kill us, but the barbarians that went past us didn't cut off our path of retreat. Instead, they kept moving forward. Of course, the barbarians have tens of thousands of people. As long as not all of them go over, they can surround us at any time. But at least this shows that the barbarians are hesitating. They are hesitating whether to kill us or not. Haha, they are running for their lives. Every minute and every second is precious. We are at the top of the mountain, and they are at the bottom. As long as they don't know about the wilderness wolf cavalry, they will think that we are still 1,000 people. So they have no choice but to hesitate." His long and narrow eyes narrowed, occasionally flashing with a calm light. "And this is our chance. Previously, we played with that crazy commander for a day and 2 nights. It is impossible for him not to be angry. Of course, he will be a little curious. He is curious as to what kind of person played him. Therefore, that crazy commander-in-chief will probably come and meet us. The only difference is whether it will be before or after the battle. If it is before the battle, we will do as you said and rush down the mountain. I will see if I can capture him. If it is after the battle, we will be surrounded by the barbarians. Then, we will fight to our heart's content. Well, if there's an opportunity, we can fall to the ground and pretend to be dead. I will certainly pretend to be dead. When that crazy commander comes up the mountain, we will capture him or drag him down with us." Pause for a while. He continued to look at the surrounding barbarians. Then, he said in a flat tone, "These are all methods of survival from the jaws of death. They all require some luck. Don't have any hope. Our luck has never been good. Well, we're just trying." David was silent. Then he nodded. If the situation was as he said, then Tang Yin's method was undoubtedly more reliable than theirs. However, David's original intention hadn't changed. No matter what the situation was, once the battle started, he would try his best to find an opportunity to help his boss break out of the encirclement. Haha, in the midst of chaos, as long as it was done, the boss wouldn't be able to do anything to us. David was secretly planning this when suddenly, a clear voice came from the side. Haha, they are here. At this time, half of the tens of thousands of barbarians had already passed by. At this time, although the enemy didn't make any obvious moves to surround them, the mountain was actually surrounded by the advancing barbarians. It was also at this time that the approaching barbarians stopped in their tracks. Then, in an orderly manner, they circled around to the sides. A dozen or so figures riding giant wolves appeared at the foot of the mountain. Needless to say, from the giant wolves alone, it was obvious that the main culprits had appeared. The wilderness wolf riders, they really did send them. Fry and the others also gathered around and stared at the enemy. The wolf stopped and raised his head to look. Frowning, Fry looked at the eye-catching giant green-armored wolf with a look of realization. The wilderness wolf riders were the elite soldiers of the heavenly wolf tribe in the northern wilderness. Ordinary barbarian generals and commanders couldn't mobilize them. The dozen or so barbarians in front of them were all riding giant green armored wolves. Clearly, they had a very close relationship with the Heavenly Wolf tribe. This also explained the origin of the 600 wilderness wolf riders that had suddenly attacked them. Of course, knowing this was useless in the current situation, Ertl clung to Luke's shoulder and asked in a low voice, "How about it? Are you confident that you can kill that lunatic with an arrow?" David was slightly taken aback when he heard this. He asked in surprise, Brother Ertl, do you know who that lunatic is?" "Of course." Ertl confidently pointed at a middle-aged barbarian standing in the middle of the giant wolves. "Look, he's standing in the middle and also at the front. Oh, there's a youngster next to him, but that youngster doesn't look proper. He doesn't even wear armor in battle. He's clearly here to gain experience. Well, he might have some status, but there's no way he's a commander. He's nothing to worry about." Luke narrowed his eyes and estimated. He scratched his head and said, "The distance isn't a problem, but he's facing us right now. He'll be able to easily dodge the arrow. Also, the beast he's riding is very agile. I'm not confident." TSK, what a pity." Ertl smacked his lips and shook his head with a sigh. The pale sun shone in the cold wind. The two parties stared at each other for a few minutes. Then, the youngster who Ertl had described as being improper stepped forward on his wolf and roared, "I'm two. Who are you?" The people on the mountain had strange expressions when they heard this. They all looked at Ertl. The latter was stunned. Then, his face twitched a few times. He looked at the sky and the ground, but didn't meet their gazes. As expected of the lunatic commander. Everything is so unexpected. Fry shook his head and sighed. Everybody knew what Ertl had speculated earlier. The man in front of them was too young. He didn't look like a commander at all. But perhaps that was precisely why he fit the definition of a lunatic. They looked at each other. Frere saw Taka's humble gesture and nodded slightly. He said loudly, "Brand's new Gray Coat Army Spear Bray Camp, Frere. Thunder's Battle Axe Battalion, Taka." "Ah, kid, listen up. I'm Thunder's Heavy Sword Battalion, Ertl." It was obvious that Ertl was very dissatisfied with his own speculation and was taking his anger out on the other party. Fate was unpredictable. Life was unpredictable. These words were sentimental. It was what Tiu had been thinking when he heard the report from the commander of the Serpentis Guard. Who would have thought that the tens of thousands of people he sent out spent a day and 2 nights and used all kinds of methods to not find a single trace of this group of people? But now, they were so easily sent to him. The previous search and capture was not a good memory. So even though Thu had taken the initiative to retreat in the end, he was actually very unwilling in his heart. Otherwise, he would not have brought hundreds of wilderness wolf cavalry to continue the pursuit. It was also because of this mentality that Tiu asked that question. "I'm Tiu, who are you?" The meaning was very simple. He could accept failure, but he couldn't accept failure when he didn't even know who his opponent was. But after hearing the words from the mountain, Tiu turned to look at Yuan Fong. He blinked and said with a blank face, "I know about the Thunderbolts Army, but what is the Gray Coat Army? Fry, Ertl, Taka, who are they?" The Bran Empire and the Northern Wilderness tribes had been at war for many years. Both sides had a good understanding of each other's military intelligence, especially those elite troops, famous generals, and commanders. They paid more attention to them. But now, even if Tiu racked his brains, he couldn't think of any of these people. This result was inevitable. Frey's reputation was great. He led the Thunder Spear Formation breaking team and had enough qualifications to be remembered by the Northern Wilderness. But that was more than 10 years of history. Naturally, not many people remembered him now. Eltek and Taka, on the other hand, were 2 unknown battalion commanders. Their squads didn't have any impressive battle records either. They were just 2 of the thousands of ordinary squads in Brand's camp. Naturally, they weren't recorded in detail. Yuan Fong frowned when he heard this. After thinking for a long time, he finally shook his head helplessly. Seeing this, Tiu's face turned ugly. Chapter 531. No matter if it was during the search or on the way to the mountain, Tiu had been trying to figure out the identity of the other party. Under those circumstances, Tiu didn't think that there would be any hidden locations that tens of thousands of people couldn't find even after a day and 2 nights. Therefore, the only possibility he could think of was that the other party was completely familiar with the pattern of their search and capture. Furthermore, the other party had targeted the route of each search team, looking for loopholes and seizing every opportunity to break through. This sounded unbelievable. After all, there were tens of thousands of people searching for them, and their efforts were quite strong. In the end, Fu himself asked in despair, "Is the other party Z?" Of course, this guess about Z wasn't reliable. Putting aside whether or not Z could do this, the key was that everyone knew that Z was in the grand border city the whole time. Furthermore, the northern wilderness tribes had their own methods of monitoring people who could turn the tides of battle around. They didn't dare to say that they knew everything, but if Z led his troops out of the grand border city, they would immediately receive news. Therefore, Tiu's guess was that the other party was a famous general from another army. Just like before, the northern wilderness had fought with the brand for so many years, so he knew a lot about the famous generals in the other army. However, who knew that when the other party reported their names, they didn't know anything about them. Furthermore, when they listened carefully, Fry, Eltek, Taka, they were all just small battalion commanders. These 1,000-plus people were not an elite team, but more like a mixed group of people. Tiu's body trembled, and his expression was very, very ugly. This feeling was like a lion walking in the dark and suddenly sensing that there was an enemy in front of it. It trembled and walked around in circles, but didn't dare to attack. In the end, it waited until dawn to find out that the person who trapped it for the night was just an insignificant ant. Yuan Fong saw that Tiu's condition wasn't right, so he quickly walked up and patted his shoulder. Phew! Exhaling a long breath, Tiu barely suppressed his anger and shouted again in a deep voice, "How did you avoid the search at that time?" Tiu couldn't help but ask this question. If he couldn't figure it out, he believed that he wouldn't feel at ease for the rest of his life. Fry and the others looked at each other and then turned to look at Tang In. However, at this time, Tang In narrowed his long and narrow eyes and observed the situation around Tiu, looking for an opportunity to attack. How would he pay attention to this? Ahem. After coughing twice, Eltek took over the conversation and said in a joking tone, "Oh, I didn't pay attention to it just now, but Brand's words are quite accurate." But, who do you think you are? Do you think we will answer your questions? You can't have this attitude. Please advise. His teasing words were interrupted. Tiu was very resentful towards this, but he was very patient. Of course, his mood was not very good. His face was gloomy as he gritted his teeth and said, "Let me ask you." "Not bad, not bad. Young people should be brave enough to admit their mistakes. Since you've asked so sincerely, I'll be merciful and tell you." Everyone on the mountain peak looked at the eloquent Eltek in shock. It was as if they were seeing him for the first time. At the foot of the mountain, Tiu's expression was not so good, but he didn't go crazy. He pursed his lips, and the faint sound of teeth grinding could be heard. His forehead was congested, and his meridians were also throbbing. "Listen carefully, kid." After a lot of long-winded talking, Eltek finally returned to the main topic. He spread his hands and said, "We didn't hide from the search. We were just walking normally. Anyway, we didn't see any of your people. I don't mean to say this, but you should really investigate your own soldiers. They must be neglecting their duties and deceiving their superiors." "Shut up." Before Eltek could finish his words, a sudden roar of thunder came from above. Eltek was stunned for a moment, then curled his lips and said innocently, "I'm doing this for your own good." Fine. Good people don't have good endings these days." After he finished speaking, he kept waving his hands as if he saw that Eltek didn't know what was good for him and was disheartened. "You are looking for death." Staring at Eltek, Tiu's voice trembled with anger. It was as if the spider web-like cracks on a glacier were emitting waves of cold air, making people shudder. But it was clear that Tiu's murderous rage didn't succeed in transmitting to Eltek. Everyone on the mountain peak looked at each other and laughed. Taka kept patting Eltek's shoulder and said things like, I didn't see it, and you're really something. Fry smiled and spread his hands with a relaxed expression. Huh, General Tu, do you think we're still afraid of death in this situation? Tu, they're trying to provoke you. Calm down. Without waiting for Tu to respond to this arrogant provocation, Yuan Fong couldn't hold it in anymore and said anxiously. Then he looked at Tu's still gloomy face and continued. We made too much noise before, so they must know that something is wrong here. Also, they must have guessed that our target is the Zechen Legion, so they're probably trying to delay us. He pointed at the mountain peak in front of them. This mountain peak isn't short, and the terrain is easy to defend but hard to attack. They've already built a defensive line, so we can't use our advantage in numbers. Also, no matter what method they use to avoid our search, the hundreds of warriors that were killed in the wilderness can't be faked. This is definitely an elite team. Now that they're ready to die, 1,000 people is enough to hold the defensive line in a short period of time. Yes, of course we can kill them, but it might take half an hour, or even longer. Pause for a while. Yuan Fong patted Tu's shoulder heavily and said seriously, they're not our enemy. We can't sacrifice 10,000 of our warriors just because of 1,000 people who don't know what's good for them, or even get wiped out. These words were said in a hurry and sounded a little exaggerated, but when combined with their current situation, it was the truth. Tu's trump card sent a clear message. The soldiers of the Zechen Legion were in disguise and were heading for their escape route, the large checkpoint. Now, both sides were in a race. If they could reach the checkpoint first, it would undoubtedly be the best outcome. But if the soldiers of the Zechen Legion arrived first and attacked the checkpoint, then their tens of thousands of people would be like turtles in a jar. It wouldn't be a joke if they were completely wiped out. In this situation, they couldn't even waste a second, let alone half an hour or an hour. After a while, I know, the rather dry words came out of Tu's mouth. It was true that he was crazy, but under such a great disparity, he could still tell the difference. After taking a deep breath, Tu looked up again, and his face returned to normal. He suddenly pointed at Air, who was laughing wildly. Hand him over, and I'll spare the rest of you. Huh? Cough, cough. Air, who was pointed at, was dumbfounded. He couldn't catch his breath and immediately started coughing. Everyone on the mountain peak subconsciously looked at Air. They were speechless. God's retribution for his cheap mouth. There was no other meaning, at least not yet. Air's face stiffened under everyone's gaze. As the person involved, his thoughts were naturally more complicated. He forced a smile and said, Haha, this is a good deal. I didn't think that I would be worth so much money one day. Frere frowned and patted Elt's shoulder. Don't think too much. We've been through thick and thin together. How could we use our brothers to make a deal? Right now, Spearbreaker's faction was the strongest, so Frere's words were a foregone conclusion. Don't worry, Air. Wait, something's wrong. Taka nodded and was about to comfort him when his expression suddenly changed. Damn it, he's trying to sow discord between us. Don't fall for it. Oomph. Looking at the small commotion on the mountain peak, Tu sneered and crossed his arms. Tu's move was insidious. He didn't have time to attack this mountain peak, but that didn't mean that he would let these people go easily, especially Air, who was constantly mocking him. As long as the other party sent Air down, even if Tu really let the others go, this team would only exist in name. Everyone would only be on guard and alert, and paper couldn't cover fire. As long as this matter was exposed, Fry and the others who survived would be cursed by thousands of brand soldiers and judged by military law. More importantly, Tu didn't lose anything by doing this. It was completely convenient. Of course, it would be better if it succeeded. He could kill Air in front of these people. Not only would it make him feel good, it would also plant a demon in the hearts of the people on the mountain peak. If it didn't succeed, at least he would be tempted by the devil. It wasn't hard to figure out this intention. Fry, Taka, and the others instantly understood. However, just as they were about to shout down the mountain to remind the people on the mountain peak and expose the other party's intention, an interested voice was heard first. Oh, how will you make us believe your promise? The mountain peak suddenly became quiet. Only the sound of the cold wind could be heard. The cold wind seemed to have blown into the hearts of the people. They turned their heads stiffly. The person who spoke was Tang Yin. At this time, he looked down the mountain as if he didn't see the eyes of the people. Tang Yin. Brother, Taka's expression was very complicated. He couldn't believe it and was also filled with grief. Old Taka. Air stood at the side with a blank expression. His eyes were dim and he licked his lips. Brother Tang and didn't do anything wrong. Everyone's survival is the most important thing. Fry frowned and looked up at Tang Yin. His expression didn't change. He believed in Tang Yin, but it didn't mean that he believed in Tang Yin's character. If it was a different environment and he had to make a choice, Fry wouldn't be surprised no matter how cruel Tang Yin was. But now, Fry didn't believe that Tang Yin was so stupid that he couldn't see through the other party's trap. Tiu at the foot of the mountain laughed when he heard this. His face was filled with mockery. He raised his hand. I swear in the name of the god of desolation. As long as you hand over air, I will immediately let you all go. No. Sigh. Yuan Fong at the side seemed to have thought of something. He waved his hand to stop Tiu from swearing. Unexpectedly, the oath was already done. He couldn't help but let out a long sigh and put down his hand. Then he saw Tiu turn his head and look at him in surprise. He smiled bitterly and shook his head slightly. Seeing this, Tiu was very puzzled. However, before he could ask, the voice from the top of the mountain sounded again. The tone was calm. Oh, then you can get lost. Chapter 532. Oh, then you can scram. The words were not polite, but the tone was very calm. Just like the judgment of the gods, it was played down, but it had the power of a conclusion that could not be changed. Tiu's face instantly darkened. His fists clenched and unclenched, then clenched and unclenched again. His nostrils slowly and heavily exhaled. He frowned and looked at Yuan Fong. What happened? The difference in tone made Tiu realize that he seemed to have made a mistake, but the person involved could not see clearly, so he did not react immediately. Yuan Fong opened his mouth and looked at Tiu. He wanted to say something, but hesitated. In the end, he said hesitantly, "He's trying to get information from you." Well, you were just careless for a moment. Don't go crazy after listening to him. Trick me. Tiu heard this and frowned even more. He ignored Yuan Fong's warning and continued to stare at the other, waiting for him to continue. And it's like this. Your plan to sow discord just now was very good, and from the chaos on the mountain peak, it should have been effective. But you should not have made such a promise. Shaking his head, Yuan Fong's expression was a little regretful. He spread out his hands and said, "Just as I said, the other party has already realized that the situation on our side is not right, and it is very likely that they are running away." And the oath he just blurted out, Sai, was too rushed and too heavy. This is undoubtedly telling the other party that our situation is worse than imagined, and that we cannot even waste any time on them. In this way, not only will your plan to sow discord be seen through, but it will also let the other party know that this is our last struggle. This is just a small language trap. It is not good enough to be shown. Brand people have always been crafty. Tiu, you don't have to pay too much attention to it. His voice gradually lowered. Yuan Fong looked at Tiu's increasingly ugly face and tried to comfort him, but in the end, he remained silent. Similar explanations were also carried out on the mountain peak. Of course, their words were not as polite to Tiu. Haha, that's the situation. Right now, the other party might not have the time to play with us. Of course, that person is a lunatic. It's very possible that he would attack us out of anger. However, as long as we can hold on, they will pay 10 times, 100 times, or even more. Haha, let's see if they dare to take the gamble. Looking at the stunned crowd, Tang Yin touched his nose and then chuckled. Let's talk about this later. You guys are the professionals when it comes to war. But, haha, Big Brother Eltec is right. This youngster is indeed useless. As the saying goes, a young man with no hair on his mouth and can't do things properly. Ha! As the laughter rang out, the stiff atmosphere on the mountain peak was instantly swept away. When the crowd understood Tang Un's words and knew that the other party was in a passive position, cheers immediately shook the sky, and the morale was greatly boosted. Among them, Eltek and Taka lowered their heads in embarrassment and kept rubbing their hands together. The two burly men looked as if they had been possessed by a young girl whose thoughts had been exposed. They were so embarrassed that they could not show their faces. Brother Tang and they were ashamed. One must know that Tang and only asked them how they could guarantee their promise, but they immediately doubted him. No matter how one looked at it, they did not trust their brother. When they thought about how their lives were saved by Tang In, they wanted to slap themselves in the face. However, Tang In shook his head and patted their shoulders. There was no trace of resentment on his face. He said with a smile, "Haha, let's not talk about it anymore. I understand. In, it's my fault for asking too hastily. I didn't inform the two of you beforehand." This was not a lie. Tang In really did understand Eltek and Taka. Because of his previous performance, his position in the team was not low. It was even higher than Frey's. In that situation, if he really handed Eltek over, no one would be able to stop him. Putting aside the combat power of the gray space, Frey also had a close relationship with him. The Spear Destroyer formation would definitely not interfere. This way, just Eltek and Taka, as well as the dozens of brand soldiers, could not do anything. No. Okay, let's not talk about it anymore. But Eltek, Taka, will say this today. In the future, as long as Brother Tang needs any help, no matter if it is a mountain of swords, a sea of fire, the abyss, or hell, we are not strong enough, but we are qualified to be cannon fodder. Sigh, you two brothers. Looking at Eltek and Taka's determined expression, Tang In touched his forehead. He knew that it was useless to say anything else. He could only spread his hands helplessly. At this moment, who are you? An angry roar came from the bottom of the mountain again. Everyone who was celebrating was stunned. Then they realized that it was Tiu who asked again. Then everyone's eyes gathered on Tang In. Without a doubt, Tiu's question must be to Tang In, who tricked him just now. He wanted to keep him as a memento. Rubbing his nose, Tang In lowered his head and met Tiu's gaze. He smiled. Hee, since General Tiu gave me face and asked, and a nameless soldier like me will not dare to neglect. Pause for a while. He waved his hand generously. Jack, my name is Jack. General Tiu, if you need any help in the future, feel free to come find me. F*CK. F*CK. The mountain peak was silent. Everyone was instantly petrified. They stared dumbfoundedly at this guy who did not know the limits of shamelessness. They were completely speechless. Such a scene was similar to a duel between generals before two armies went to war, solemnly announcing their names to each other. Although there was a risk of being remembered, from a certain point of view, this was also a kind of glory that couldn't be pulled off. But Tang In was different. He first waved his hand generously and then gave a fake name, Jack. Tiu murmured in a low voice. Of course, he did not know what was going on. He just remembered the name in his heart and prepared to go back and ask the intelligence agency here to investigate. Tiu, the situation now was really delicate. Yuan Fong was very worried that Tiu would order the soldiers to attack in a rage. So, he carefully observed Tiu's uncertain expression and asked tentatively. Phew! Taking a deep breath, Tiu narrowed his eyes. He paused for 3 seconds, lowered his head and waved, "Let's go." After saying that, he directly rode the wolf forward. This straightforwardness made Yuan Fong, who was worried about personal gains and losses, stunned for a moment. When the officer behind reminded him, his face became happy and he quickly chased after them. In fact, Tiu's reason for doing this was very simple. Before instigating, he had already made up his mind. He knew that now was not the time to go crazy. And since this was the case with his identity, it was similar to the green mountains do not change, and the green water flows forever. Just you wait. This kind of street thug's ruthless words was naturally not something that could be said out loud. So, it was better to leave early. Out of sight, out of mind. During the conversation on the mountain peak, the surrounding barbarian soldiers did not stop moving forward. So, after Tiu and the others left, tens of thousands of barbarians entered the forest and disappeared after a few turns. Not only did Yuan Fong not react to Tiu's straightforward departure, everyone on the mountain peak was also stunned as they watched the barbarians gradually disappear in front of them. They did not recover for a long time. With a grin, Tang In gave a thumbs up in the direction where the barbarians disappeared and praised from the bottom of his heart. Damn, as expected of a lunatic. Even though they knew that the barbarians were in a terrible situation from their previous probing and observation, Tang In and the others did not know the details. They thought that no matter what, the barbarians would at least launch a few attacks. Or they might even leave some people behind to fight to the death with them. They had also made preparations to resist. If they fought, they would not do anything else but to delay the barbarians in front of them for as long as possible. Then, they would let the barbarians suffer a backlash and pay the price. But now, the other party didn't even say a single harsh word and just walked away. This kind of unexpected behavior could only be explained by Tang In saying, as expected of a lunatic. Normal people would never be able to understand the world of a lunatic, and they could not afford to hurt him. Seeing that they had once again narrowly escaped death, everyone was excited. But now they did not dare to show off. They asked David and the others to follow and take a look while they quietly walked along the gentle slope and went straight into the wilderness defense zone of the Zichan Legion. It was only when David and the others caught up and confirmed that the barbarians did not have any backup plans and went straight to the other side of the mountain that cheers suddenly erupted in the boundless wilderness. "Ha, we won again." "Oh, then you can get lost." "Ha ha." Mr. Tang's words were decisive and domineering. The barbarians really listened and obediently got lost. That's right. Ask that northern wilderness empress to personally bring her troops over to take a look. Hee, as long as Mr. Tang is here, would she dare to say no? Damn it, stop talking. What does this have to do with me? My face is already swollen. Listening to this more and more out-of-tune worship, a certain someone touched his forehead and covered his face as he scurried away. Chapter 533. The Bran and the Northern Wilderness have been fighting for so many years, and the front lines that stretched for thousands of miles were filled with the flames of war. If one were to exaggerate, almost every inch of the land here was soaked in dark red blood. Of course, it was only almost. Compared to the frequent battles that happened every 2 to 3 days, the Zichan Legion's defense zone was particularly peaceful. Due to the fear of Z's tyrannical power, the barbarians rarely set the flames of war on this area in the past 10 years. Even if they did, they would be successfully intercepted and dealt with on the outskirts. Therefore, the civilians in this defense zone felt very strange. They were in an area where the flames of war were burning, but they had enjoyed a peaceful life for more than 10 years. They had almost forgotten what the barbarians were like. The barbarians were like this, and so were the soldiers of the other legions. Therefore, when they arrived here, and Tucker's rich experience could not be used. It was not that they had not been to the Zichan Legion's defense zone before, but it was basically for the sake of wartime. They hurriedly walked around and left again, so they were not familiar with the terrain. Under such circumstances, the group had no choice but to simply walk towards the east, thinking that they would eventually meet the patrolling soldiers of the Zichan Legion. However, what they didn't know was that Tiwu had already brought his men to do the demolition and removal work. They had already removed more than half of the Purple Star Army stronghold. Therefore, if they did not walk for half a day, they could not expect to meet any living people. Fortunately, Tang In and the others were in a good mood and did not care about this. For them, after more than 10 days of running for their lives, being able to walk under the sun was already a rare blessing. In addition, they had just narrowly escaped death, and the group was joking and telling dirty jokes. It was very lively. As they talked and laughed, the group did not know how long they had been walking. It was about half a day because the sky was gradually darkening and dusk was approaching. It was also at this time that the group finally met a group of soldiers wearing standard armor. Or more accurately, they were surrounded by the other party. The group did not panic. For people like them who entered without asking, it was inevitable that the other party would be cautious. As expected, when they got closer, they probably saw that they were not burly barbarians. The surrounding soldiers immediately stopped and put down their weapons. Then, a few burly figures came forward. He gave a standard military salute. Zeichin 3rd Army Light Armor Battalion, Barthas. Returning the military salute, Thunder 4th Army Heavy Sword Battalion, Eltek. Tomahawk Battalion, Taka. New Gray Coat Army, Spear Breaker, Fry. The three armies at the front lines were competing with each other, both openly and secretly. However, this was a time of war, and they were united against the enemy, so there was less scheming than usual. After the introduction, the burly man named Barthas did not have the arrogance of a member of the Zeichin Legion. He was rather forthright and talkative. On the other hand, Fry and the others were here to seek shelter from danger. Naturally, they chimed in. Therefore, everyone quickly contacted each other and headed to the nearest checkpoint together. Although they were temporarily sure that Tang In and the others were brand soldiers, Barthas naturally wanted to ask them why they were here. Tang In had already discussed this with Fry and the others. First, they could not say that Winard had framed them. After all, Winard was a lieutenant general. Although this was the Zeichin Legion, and logically speaking, there should not be any connection between them and Winard. However, in order to avoid possible complications, the best choice was to keep it a secret before solving the problem. Next, they could talk about breaking out of the encirclement of tens of thousands of barbarians, but the problem was that the other party would not believe them. Therefore, in the end, Fry only vaguely said that his 3rd Army Battalion was patrolling and was attacked by barbarians. They could only retreat here and suffered heavy losses along the way. There were only a few of them left here. This was naturally believable because it was the truth. Furthermore, after going through the ravine for more than 10 days, everyone looked no different from barbarians. This was also the reason why Barthas and the others were so close before putting down their weapons. After hearing Frey's words, Barthas nodded and looked at everyone. He lamented, "We've all heard about the situation in the wilderness. Barbarians are everywhere. More than 1,000 of you traverse the wilderness. It's already a miracle that so many of you survived and made it here." Fry and the others could not help but smile bitterly. Who knew that if it were not for the wilderness wolf riders, there would be more of them who would have made it here alive? Barthas misunderstood their expressions and consoled them. Don't be too sad. Dying on the battlefield is also the end of a soldier. The next time you see the barbarians, kill a few of them and take it as revenge for them. Even though he had misunderstood the situation, his words made sense. Tang In and the others nodded in agreement. Then, Eltek changed the topic and asked casually, "Brother Barthas, you don't seem surprised that we're here at all?" "Haha, of course." Barthas raised his head and laughed. He explained, "Brothers, you may not know this, but you're not the first group to come here. A few days ago, there were often other teams from the Thunderbolt's army hiding in our defense area. However, you're the first to traverse the wilderness with only 1,000 of you. Basically, the ones who came here were divisions. I heard that there were a few generals who suffered heavy losses." Barthas' words were full of pride. It was probably because the Zeichin Legion was strong enough to become a shelter. However, this was understandable because it was the truth. Fry and the others nodded in realization. Yes, they were not the only ones who thought of running here. Considering the situation in the wilderness at that time, this was indeed the most suitable shelter when the situation was unfavorable. "Oh, right." Fry seemed to have thought of something and quickly said, "When we came here, we saw tens of thousands of barbarians. What's going on?" Barthas grinned. "Oh, them. Ha! They've been here for almost a week. They've only been tearing down our abandoned military strongholds. They don't dare to go deeper." Fry was surprised. "Abandoned?" Barthas nodded. "Yes, there hasn't been a real battle here for a few years. Some of the buildings in the strongholds are seriously old and dilapidated. We're also having a headache. Let's tear them down. This is a huge project. We're also a little reluctant to do so. After all, they could still be used. If we don't tear them down, we can't build new ones. Barthas scratched his head to express his distress. Then he smiled happily. But it's good now. These barbarians spent a week tearing down most of the buildings. It saved us a lot of trouble. Tang In, Fry, and the others looked at each other. They were all speechless. Then they collectively made a gesture in front of their chest to mourn for the tens of thousands of barbarians that they had just seen. However, Barthas still seemed a little dissatisfied. He touched the sword at his waist. Of course, it's because our commanding officer ordered us not to attack. Otherwise, we wouldn't have let these barbarians wander around our defense area. Forget it. There's no point in talking about this. Well, your luck is not bad. Fortunately, you didn't encounter those tens of thousands of barbarians. Haha. Yes, fortunately we didn't encounter them. Frey's smile was a little stiff. He and Tang looked at each other, and the corners of their mouths twitched. Then, they changed the topic. I saw that those barbarians were in a hurry. It seemed like they were running for their lives. Did you guys do something? Is there such a thing? Barthas scratched his head and shook his head. I'm not too sure about this, but this may be an important piece of information. I'll report it to my superiors after I send you to the checkpoint. Well, thank you, brothers. Barthas was only a battalion commander and was still patrolling. Obviously, he hadn't received any orders from his superiors. Naturally, he didn't know about this. Brother Barthas is too polite. We just happened to see it and casually mentioned it. We don't deserve your thanks. As they chatted, a faint outline of a checkpoint appeared before their eyes before the sky turned completely dark. There were a few flickering flames on the walls. With Barthas leading the way, they entered the checkpoint after a simple search by the soldiers guarding the city. The checkpoints in the brand were similar. What they saw were all defensive equipment and patrolling soldiers. It was the same here. There wouldn't be any special equipment just because they were from the Zichan Legion. After sending them to the inner gate of the checkpoint, Barthas pointed to the soldier beside him and said, "Now, brothers, you just need to follow him. Well, it's just a simple registration. Then, they will open a passage for you. It's just a routine procedure." "Okay, thank you, Brother Barthas. We'll treat you to a drink when we have time." That's great. I'll be waiting." After exchanging a few pleasantries, Barthas turned and strode away. However, he didn't go to the wilderness outside. Instead, he went to a certain place inside the checkpoint. He was probably going to report the information that the barbarians had retreated. Tang In and the others followed the soldier to the left. After walking for a short distance, a house made of thick stones appeared in front of them. The soldier who led the way opened the door and said a few words with a smile. He seemed to have a good relationship with the people inside. Then, he waved his hand and invited them in. The so-called registration was similar to what Tang In and the others had to write down their military ranks and the legion they belonged to. Then, the other party would check and confirm that there were no mistakes. They would then open a passage for them. With this passage, they would be able to travel through the cities behind them. Of course, the other party would also provide them with food and lodging until they left this defensive area and returned to their legion. This kind of work should only be done by Fry, Eltek, and Taka. However, Tang In's position was closer to the front, so the soldier who led the way treated him as an officer and invited him in. Tang In only knew about this after he came in. He rubbed his nose and didn't pay much attention to it. He consciously stood to the side. Then, out of boredom, he looked around the office of the checkpoint. To be honest, it was very simple. There was only a table and a few benches. The only eye-catching thing was the wooden cabinet at the back that looked like a bookcase. After Fry and the others registered, a soldier opened the cabinet and took out a stack of papers. Tang In's eyes were sharp. He saw the handwriting of the 4 armies of thunder on the papers. He suddenly realized that this was the proof that the other party had checked. Probably noticing Tang In's gaze, Fry came over and explained, "The brand military will record all the active military officers." Of course, This is only a checkpoint, so it can only be above the battalion level. Also, it only has simple information, such as names. When we enter the cities behind us, we will go through another registration. Then, the inspection will be more detailed. Tang Yin nodded in understanding. After all, this place was close to the front lines. Moreover, it was a time of war. Naturally, the management would not be sloppy. Just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, unexpectedly, after the initial shock, the sound of pages flipping could be heard. Tang Yin and Fry subconsciously turned their heads. They saw Eltek's body trembling violently. He was almost unable to move. Taka, who was next to him, poked his head over. In an instant, he had the same reaction. Because the two of them had their backs facing each other, Tang Yin did not know what was going on. However, from the strong body movements, Tang Yin had reason to believe that their faces were filled with shock. At this time, Eltek had already turned around. He was holding a book in his hands. It should be the book that they had just registered. He took a few big steps and walked in front of Tang Yin and Fry. He pointed at a page and said with a strange expression, "Look." Tang Yin lowered his head. There were lines of handwriting on the page. Some of the strokes were like dragons and snakes. Their strength penetrated the back of the paper. Some of the strokes were like earthworms. They were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. It was pure and natural. As for the position that Eltek's carrot-like short finger was pointing at, the handwriting was excellent. It seemed to be quite powerful. The content was Deputy General of Thunder's Third Army, Wiener. Wiener? It sounds a little familiar. Before Tang Yin could react, a hoarse voice that had suppressed its anger to the extreme sounded beside his ear. Red Mao Itachi. Chapter 534. Life was often more exciting than novels and dramas. Just like candy, before the wrapper was removed, one would never know what kind of sweet or bitter taste would greet one's taste buds. It was normal to enter the city and register when going to someone else's territory. But just as the soldiers were busy looking through the information and Ayrton was flipping through the registration book out of boredom, he found a name that made him both surprised and angry. Wiener. Without any rest, Fry and the rest forgot about their promise to treat Barthas to a drink. After asking the soldiers who were in charge of the office, the troops left the city that very night and rushed to the rear. This night was destined to be a restless one. At the leftmost checkpoint of the Thunderbolts' army's defensive zone, Tu, who was leading tens of thousands of barbarians, clashed with the Zechen Legion soldiers who had just taken down the checkpoint. On a narrow path, one was tightening the encirclement, while the other was rushing to break through and escape. Without any hesitation, the two sides immediately clashed, and the sounds of battle shook the sky. Immediately after, many Zechen Legion soldiers rushed out from the surrounding mountains and joined in the encirclement. From the very beginning, the battle had entered a white-hot state where bayonets could see red. In the beginning, the few thousand Zechen Legion soldiers who had taken down the checkpoint were at a disadvantage. This was inevitable, as they didn't expect the barbarians to arrive so quickly. They didn't even have time to rest at the checkpoint that they had just taken down. The city walls were broken, and there were only a few intact defensive equipment. It was basically useless. Under such circumstances, they were naturally at a disadvantage against the barbarians who were several times stronger than them. Fortunately, this situation didn't last long. Just as the barbarian vanguard rushed into the checkpoint, the Zechen Legion soldiers who were lying in ambush rushed out and surrounded the tens of thousands of barbarians at the back. At this point, the outcome of the battle was clear. The barbarians were bound to break through. The only difference was the time it would take for the barbarians to break through and the number of casualties. Tu was very clear about this point, but seeing the Zechen Legion soldiers seizing the opportunity to isolate and kill the barbarians at the back, his heart was still bleeding. This time, the ambush on the Purple Star Army was a failure and also a joke. Although he had led his troops around the Zechen Legion's defensive zone for a week and destroyed more than half of the enemy's military strongholds, he seemed invincible and mighty. But in reality, the number of enemy soldiers destroyed was extremely small. But now, the other party had used a small trick to deal a heavy blow to the other side. The difference in strength was obvious. Of course, no matter how unwilling he was, Tu could only lead as many people as possible to retreat. Moreover, at this moment, he couldn't help but rejoice in his heart. Fortunately, the news from the trump card was timely. Otherwise, this side would have been completely wiped out. The battle continued for about half the night. In the end, Tu abandoned more than 1,000 barbarian warriors and led his troops to break out of the encirclement. Then, he rushed towards the boundless wilderness under the dark curtain. At about dawn, a piece of information was sent to the center of the grand border city through a hidden channel. It was sent to an exaggeratedly warm room. The room was as messy as always, filled with all kinds of documents and maps. In the corner, there were many burning charcoal furnaces, almost turning the room into a blazing volcano. Only Z, in his purple robe, was in the room. He sat quietly and looked at the information on the table. If Tang In, Fry, Eltek, and even Barthas were here, they would definitely be familiar with this information. This was because this was the information that Barthas had sent to his superiors. The content was very simple. On a certain day, at noon, a group that came here to seek refuge found traces of tens of thousands of barbarians near the mountain range. The barbarians were retreating in a hurry. Time, place, and event. Everything was very simple, just like the insignificant information sent back by the scouts during an army's march. But this simple information, if it fell into the eyes of someone who knew the inside story, such as Z, they would immediately realize that something was wrong. The time wasn't right. The plan to encircle and annihilate the barbarians was only 2 days ago. Thus, there were only two possibilities. First, the barbarians had a keen sense of smell and immediately chose to retreat when they sensed that something was wrong. Second, there was a spy who leaked the plan to the barbarians. Cough, cough. Continuous coughing broke the silence in the room. After a while, Z put down his hand that was covering his mouth. His expression was neither happy nor sad, and no one could tell what he was feeling. He then took a deep breath, reached out, and crumpled the piece of paper into a ball and threw it lightly into the furnace not far away. The piece of paper quickly turned yellow, curled, and turned into black ashes in the fire. He sighed. "I'm a coward. Don't force me." The sky was slightly bright. In a small city within the Zechen Legion's defense zone, Fry and the others were travel-worn. After confirming their identities, they walked out of the office and nodded at Tang, who was waiting outside. The group continued to move forward and cross the city. At this time, the city was still in a deep sleep. The wide roads were covered by a light morning fog, and there was basically no one in sight. The route is correct. He's still in front of us. But he's getting close. We should be able to catch up by noon. After a night of running, Fry had already calmed down and explained the situation calmly. Tang nodded and smiled. Haha, this is called searching high and low for something, only to find it without any effort. When do you plan to make a move? The sooner the better. Fry pursed his lips, and a murderous look flashed across his face. He narrowed his eyes and said, I've already asked around. He came out with a division of soldiers, but he suffered heavy losses. There are only about 1,000 people left. Now, we're in the dark, and they're in the light. As long as we plan well and go straight into the middle of the army, the chances of success are very high. Fry was still a rational person. After a short moment of hot-headedness, he quickly sorted out the pros and cons of both sides and made the decision to make a move as soon as possible. He wasn't in a hurry to take revenge, or even if he was, it wasn't all. After all, Winard was a lieutenant general. If he returned to the Thunderbolts Army's defense zone, it would be difficult for them to make a move. Then what else is there to say? Let's hurry up and kill him. Taka tightened his grip on the short battle axe in his hand. His murderous look was overflowing. Whether it was for his saviors like Tang, In, and Fry, or for the soldiers on his side that were almost completely wiped out, Taka had enough reason to take revenge. Eltek was the same. He opened his eyes wide and said gruffly, That's right. Brother Fry, give the order. What should we do? Fry shook his head and said calmly, No, it's what we should do. As for you guys, stay in the city and leave in 3 hours. What? Impossible. Eltek and Taka instantly lost their voice. They couldn't believe their ears. Then, they said anxiously, Brother Fry, what do you mean? Yes, we don't have a lot of people, but even if we have to be bait or cannon fodder, I have no complaints. That's right. And Brother Fry, this isn't just about you. My dead brothers are still buried in the wilderness. If I can't kill Winar with my own hands, how am I going to answer to them when I go to hell? Fry waved his hand. Don't get too worked up. Let me finish. Fry calmed the two people down and said calmly, We've been through life and death together for so many days. You guys are my life and death brothers. If the situation allows, I won't leave you guys behind to take revenge. But the situation is different now. After we kill Winard, we'll turn ourselves in. At this time, we need someone to stand out and testify for us and tell us what happened in the wilderness. Pause for a while patted Eltek and Taka's shoulders. And this person can only be an outsider. If they're involved, no one will believe what they say. So, I asked you guys to stay in the city for a few hours just to show your faces and give others the impression that we're not close and that we're parting ways. Yes, please. Eltek and Taka were silent at the same time. They knew that Fry was right. Although the Grey Coat Army and Blank's army were working together, the relationship between the soldiers on both sides was not good. Take them for example. If it weren't for Tang, In, and the others saving their lives time and time again, and knowing Frey's true identity, they wouldn't have been on the brink of death together. They might not have been on good terms with each other. Their relationship was tense when they first met. They even mocked and ridiculed each other. So, it was undoubtedly the best strategy to have them testify. Of course, this was on the premise that they didn't participate in what happened next. Otherwise, as the parties involved, no matter what they said, others would preemptively think that they were in cahoots. After understanding this, Eltek and Taka could only nod helplessly. They told everyone to stab Winard a few more times as revenge for them. Then, they sent Tang, In, and the others out of the city. Stepping on the official road outside the city, everyone's face suddenly turned cold. No one was allowed to come near them. Skinny Monkey, Bamboo Pole, Big Bear, and Frey's old brothers were needless to say. Under the new and old grudges, they couldn't wait to chop Winard up. Although the other soldiers of the Spear Breaker army joined later, whether it was because of the grudge between Fry and the others, they had a common enemy, or because of the brothers who had died in the previous escape. They were all red-eyed. While running in silence, Fry suddenly turned his head and said, Tang, with our friendship, there shouldn't be any need to say anything, but now you're involved, since there's no need to say it, then don't say it. Tang obviously knew what Fry was thinking. He interrupted him and said, I was the one who advised you to join the Grey Coat Army. Of course I'm responsible. Besides, you know me, I don't have a big heart, but I'm a vengeful person. That red-haired weasel almost killed me and almost buried me and the entire gray space in the wilderness. Naturally, I have to get back at him. After a brief explanation, Tang In changed the topic and smiled. Let me interview you, Brother Fry. Back then, you led people to attack thousands of miles and cut off the head of the gilded aristocrat. Now, you're attacking hundreds of miles to chop Winard. Do you feel different? Interview? Fry was slightly stunned. Then he shook his head and smiled bitterly. It's about the same. It's like going through a reincarnation cycle. The difference is that the person I killed is different, and I'm still as impulsive. Haha, that's the rhythm. I like this kind of impulsiveness. Yes, me too. Aha. Chapter 535. At noon, the sky was high and the clouds were light. On top of a large city wall, a soldier, squatting on a tall watchtower, suddenly squinted his eyes. He saw many vague figures neatly lined up at the end of the official road. He didn't panic. Of course, there was no need for that. This was the Zechen Legion's defense area, so it was very safe. Even if there were enemies, there should be someone in front to report back in advance. Sure enough, when they got closer, a few small figures in the group ran up a mound. Then, a few eye-catching flags of different colors were waved continuously. Friendly forces, safe. Thunder Legion, division level, more than 1,300 people. Oh, another one who came to seek refuge. The soldier squinted his eyes and interpreted the meaning of the flag signal in a low voice. Of course, the last sentence was pure ridicule. There were no telephones in the other world. Civilian communication was basically through shouting. However, the army obviously couldn't do that. The intelligence of people was infinite. Therefore, the scouts who specialized in transmitting information and the flag signal now were all methods of communication. Flag signals were suitable for short to medium distance. For a group of more than 1,000 people to enter the city, there was no doubt that it was better to greet first to avoid any misunderstandings. Just as the soldier on the lookout was looking over here, two people riding horses in the group were also looking at the city in the distance. If there was someone who knew about Brand's military rank here, they would be able to recognize from the insignia on their arms that they were a deputy general and a division commander. Both of them looked middle-aged. Judging from their appearance and temperament, the deputy general should be slightly older than the division commander. Of course, this was only a guess. The main reason was that although the deputy general had a head of non-mainstream dark red curly hair, his appearance was dignified and calm. On the other hand, the division commander was emitting a murderous aura. However, the calm deputy general seemed a little absent-minded. Although his eyes were staring at the city in the distance, there was no focus. The division commander beside him didn't notice at first. Later, when he saw the deputy general maintain the posture for a long time, he realized that he was absent-minded. He coughed twice and said, "General, we are here." "Yes." The deputy general nodded slightly, still absent-minded. Seeing this, the division master came closer and said, "General, you don't have to worry. The previous battle was a result of the current situation. No one would have thought that the barbarians would rush over like mad dogs. When we go back and reassemble our forces, we will definitely be able to fight a beautiful comeback and vent our frustrations." The deputy general finally came back to his senses and said with a non-committal smile, "All right, I'll wait to see you make a comeback." The division commander knew that he had guessed wrongly. Then, he raised his eyebrows as if he had thought of something. He lowered his voice and said, "General, are you thinking about that arrogant guy, Before he finished speaking, the deputy general suddenly turned his head as if his thoughts had been read. His eyes were as sharp as a knife. But when he saw the middle-aged teacher's stunned expression, his eyes dimmed, and he shook his head gently. I'm old. Myson, you've been with me for decades, so you know what happened back then. Well, I don't know what's going on these past few days, but I keep having the feeling that that fellow will suddenly jump out and stab me with a gun. Perhaps the older I get, the more cowardly I become." General, you're joking. You're at the peak of your power. Not long ago, when you broke out of the encirclement, you cut off the head of a barbarian who blocked your way with a knife. You're not old at all. The middle-aged division commander, called Myson, shook his head and laughed. There was no trace of flattery in his expression. Then, he pondered for a moment and said casually, "General, you don't have to worry too much. No matter how that arrogant guy escaped back then, since he didn't obediently find a place to hide and conceal his identity. Instead, he dares to swagger to the front line. He's looking for death." Pause for a while. This Myson really lived up to his appearance and temperament. The moment he opened his mouth, he was filled with a bloody and murderous aura. And he also deserves to die. He was recognized by Grey Eagle, who was the archery instructor behind him. This is the will of God. He wants us to attack again and send him to hell. Although because of this damn barbarian, we lost contact with Colorado. But if I'm not wrong, I'm afraid that he's already dead in the wilderness. His flesh and blood were eaten by the vultures. Not even his bones are left. Speaking of Colorado, this red-haired lieutenant was naturally the red-haired weasel that Fry and the others had mentioned. Hearing Myson's confident words, he didn't show any excitement or joy. Instead, He narrowed his eyes and looked at the city wall that was getting closer and closer. His expression was somewhat reminiscent. It's too early to say this. Fry isn't someone who gives up easily, and he's not someone who's easy to deal with. Well, actually, I've always admired him, and even somewhat admired him. If it wasn't for fate playing tricks on us and letting us be assigned to the same division at the same time, we would have been able to be compared. I believe that we would have become good friends and even brothers who would entrust our lives to each other on the battlefield. It's a pity that we're destined to only be enemies. And he's too outstanding, so outstanding that the people around him can't even shine a little bit. They can only curl up and squat in his shadow. At this point, there was a hint of resentment in Weisson's words. He probably realized it himself, so he shut his mouth and slowed down. Weisson nodded silently. He and Gray Eagle, who had been transferred to the rear as an archery instructor, were old men who had followed Weisson for decades. They were also members of the Squall Daggers back then, so they naturally knew how Weisson felt. In fact, when they compared themselves to the soldiers of the Thunder Spear Formation breaking team, how could they not feel the same way? Of course, it's meaningless to talk about this now. Weisson shook his head slightly. Since he's already an enemy, then naturally, we have to kill him by any means necessary. This is like spilled water. It's impossible to take it back. The only thing we can do now is to sprinkle some dust and completely bury the traces of water. Don't worry, General. Weisson raised his head slightly, the murderous look on his face becoming more intense. This is no longer Frey's era. Even if that brat Colorado didn't kill him, with our current position, we have plenty of opportunities to play him to death. Weisson didn't object this time and nodded slightly. That was the truth. Weisson was now a deputy general, while Fry was only a battalion commander from the Gray Coat Army. No matter how one looked at it, there was no suspense. However, he still said cautiously, "This matter has to be resolved as soon as possible." He might not know that I was the one behind the scenes in the past, but he was the one who killed that noble. If we interrogate him and spread it, it will be a big problem. He paused, as if he had thought of something, and continued, "Oh, there's more. Although Fry isn't a big threat to us now, we can't underestimate him. That lunatic Baylor was his subordinate back then. If he knows that Fry isn't dead, we won't have any more opportunities to act." Most people in the Thunderbolts army knew that Baylor had participated in the encirclement of the Gray Coat Army last year. However, no one had heard of Baylor's encounter with Fry. The reason for this was, of course, because Baylor hadn't spread it after returning. After all, the relationship between the Gray Coat Army and the Brand was very tense. If Frey's identity was exposed, it would draw hatred. As for now, Baylor really didn't know that Fry had come to the front lines. Otherwise, with his status, how could he have let Fry and the others go to the front lines in the wilderness to be cannon fodder? Understood. Mason nodded. Baylor was a general, one level higher than Weisson. Of course, they had to avoid him carefully. "General, don't worry. When we return this time, I'll immediately investigate all the news about Fry. After so many years, they're still in the light, and we're still in the dark." Last time, he was able to run thousands of miles to kill that retarded noble. Will he be able to run over and kill us this time? These mocking words made Weisson's lips curl up, and he laughed softly. At this time, the advancing troops had reached the city gate. The soldiers guarding the city had already received the news from the watchtower. They politely went forward to verify the passage and then waved their hands to let them pass. However, at this time, suddenly, uproar, a commotion came from behind. Weisson turned his head in shock and then frowned. He saw a small troop rushing to the city gate at the same time. Looking at the style of their armor, they were actually from the Thunderbolts army. However, they looked very anxious, and their actions were barbaric and violent. They even broke through the formation here and forced their way to the city gate. Normally, it was a taboo for the army to cross and crash into the formation of other troops for no reason. This involved the soldiers' sense of honor. If they weren't careful, it would lead to a group fight. It was no wonder that Weisson frowned and was somewhat dissatisfied when he saw this. The soldiers guarding the city had already gone over, but the negotiation wasn't very smooth. They saw a big man holding up a passage and roaring loudly, "Get out of the way, all of you get out of the way. We have people here who are injured and want to enter the city for treatment now. How dare you block me?" Scram! Wise Sun understood. They were rushing to send injured soldiers into the city for treatment. In such a hurry, the other party naturally couldn't care about anything else. Mason's face darkened when he saw this. Damn, which troop are these bastards from? How dare they rush to my division? Forget it. Waving his hand, Wise was magnanimous. He moved his horse to the side and said, "Disperse, let them go in first." Stopping injured soldiers from entering the city for treatment was unreasonable no matter where it was spread. Although with Wisen's rank, the other party couldn't do anything if he really wanted to go in first, it was obviously better not to do something like this that would ruin his reputation. Mason knew this too, so even though he was somewhat dissatisfied, he still waved his hand and got his soldiers to disperse to the sides and open up a path straight to the city gate. Very quickly, the group of hurried soldiers at the back walked into the center of the formation and approached Wise-sun and the rest. Wise-sun suddenly frowned. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that some of the soldiers were looking in his direction. Their gazes were somewhat familiar. Mason didn't care. He saw that these soldiers were covered in blood and mud and were in a terrible state. Some of them were even carried on simple stretchers. He couldn't help but smack his lips.